The time is 1986. Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. We survived the Carter administration with its misery index, following the national embarrassment when our leadership allowed defeat in Vietnam and the subsequent mockery of those who dedicated their lives to protecting us and our freedoms, our military. We survived gas rationing and the importation of substandard steel. Manufacturing went overseas at breakneck speed, and inflation reached double digits. There were no things like cell phones, the World Wide Web, digital television, iPods, iPads, and other little devices to keep us entertained. The cassette was still king, and the CD was just coming into fashion. VHS and Beta were vying for supremacy in the home television recording business. You had to take out a small loan to buy a camcorder, and you needed strong shoulders or a good tripod and lots of space to hold it. Computers were used mostly for business and still had little use for gaming. The IBM Personal Computer, PC, was the most popular because of its business applications. The Apple II was king in the classroom. Graphics were rudimentary. The Commodore 64 was arguably the best console for gaming. Video stores were popping up, but you had to buy a subscription to rent a video player or tape. If you lived in a rural area, you relied on a couple of over-the-air channels and a tall tower with an antenna on top or a 6 or 8 foot long analog dish to receive more channels. You paid money for long-distance phone service to call friends and relatives. Sometimes there was an extra charge for calling just a few miles away. Thus begins our story. Charles, let's call him Chuck. Newmeyer sat at an unfamiliar bar and considered the contents of a shot glass. He drank beer occasionally, but couldn't remember the last time he'd gotten drunk. He intended to start a new tradition that depended on getting drunk enough to forget that particular day. The amber liquid from the bourbon in the glass was a beautiful color, he decided. In fact, this particular shade of amber might be his new favorite color, replacing the red that his wife Marcy preferred, and because she liked it, became his favorite color by default. Chuck turned the glass slowly, held it up to the light, and looked at the distant objects through the glass. This was his 8th shot of bourbon since he'd stumbled into this bar. Or was it the 9th? He didn't care anymore. He just wished he didn't care about anything else. He tipped the shot glass back and didn't even flinch at the burn. It must be working, he thought, since I don't feel any physical pain. But when will the mental pain stop? The bartender gestured for him to pour him another. Chuck sat and pondered the next glass, remembering the past. He'd been born just a few miles from his current residence in Crocketville's only hospital. He had grown up here and had only left for a few years to get a degree in construction before returning and taking a job with an old family friend, Billy Chase, who owned and operated Chase Construction. Over the years, Chuck managed to do just about everything from concrete work, block and brick laying, to roughing in and then finishing. During the worst of times, Billy switched to a handyman job and Chuck was assigned minor window replacements, small repairs, and even learned some plumbing techniques that helped bring in the money needed to keep the job going. They put up barns, steel farm buildings, and grain bins as needed. It wasn't something they wanted to deal with on a regular basis, but in hard and lean times, you have to do what you have to do. Chuck was now the project manager. This allowed Billy to find the time to pursue the sale of the new business. As project manager, Chuck oversaw the hiring of crews, assigning work and assigning subcontractors. Sometimes things could get heated, and he, as manager, had to diffuse the situation. Sometimes talking helped, but other times a couple of guys needed a good shakeup. Chuck was only 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 186 pounds, but he'd grown up in a rough and rowdy construction business, so he wasn't afraid to knock each other over the head when necessary. In this business, respect is key, so he had to be a little tougher than his toughest guy and not tolerate rudeness. He did. In 1986, the construction industry was in trouble again. Work was scarce. Everything was under strain. Marcy Newmeyer was Chuck's anchor. A couple years younger than Chuck, at 48, she was a typical middle-aged woman. She was still his high school sweetheart, but at 5 feet 4 inches tall, she had a few extra pounds on her, but Chuck was never embarrassed by that. They literally grew up together and attended the same schools until they graduated from high school. They had been dating since 8th grade. The only rift in their budding relationship happened a few weeks before their senior year prom. They went to the junior prom together, and the whole town knew that this couple was destined to be together. Their high school years were in the late 1950 SS, and once you chose your soulmate, you were meant to stay with her. No one dared mess with you or your constancy. Chuck gave Marcy his sweater when he was a junior in high school, and she was a freshman and only borrowed it to add chevrons or hardware to her sweater, a big C for Crocketville High School. When he bought the ring for the class, he wore it for only a week and then gave it to Marcy. She immediately wound yarn around it so she could wear it proudly on her finger. Since she was a few years behind him, he didn't get her ring until his sophomore and senior year. Her ring hung around his neck as a necklace at all times. He didn't even take it off when he took a bath. Just before prom, a snake snuck into their Garden of Eden. Chuck was one of the few boys in school at that time who had his own car. It was a big Oldsmobile that he bought for a couple $100, a fortune in those days. He and his father would tune the engine until it rumbled. It was a big engine, and it could push a heavy steel sled down the road at 80 miles an hour. Marcy was always proud to sit next to Chuck on the bench. Many people had good-naturedly teased them, saying it took 2 people to drive that big machine. It also had plenty of room for friends, and became the place to go to the river to swim in the summer, the river to skate in the winter, baseball and softball games, dances, movies, soccer hops, and anything else they could get their hands on. In fact, most people rarely saw one without the other at any time, except when Chuck was working for his uncle on the farm, a few miles out of town. Chuck met Marcy in the school cafeteria, where they usually had a mystery meat lunch. Marcy, I know we've been dating forever, but I don't want it to seem like you're taking me for granted. Will you go to the prom with me this year? He smiled, for they had been talking about this prom for a long time now. Marcy Baines looked up at her boyfriend and stated, "Sorry, Chuck, but you're a little late. Jimmy Willis asked me to prom and I said yes. I know you love me and I love you, but I've never dated anyone but you, so I figured I needed to spread my wings a little." Everyone within earshot took a deep breath and held their breath. It wasn't done. You didn't ditch your boyfriend for good on the eve of the biggest social event in school. Everyone watched Chuck intently. Chuck was confused and afraid he was going to throw up. A hard kick to the stomach on the soccer field had never made him feel so sick so quickly. He also didn't realize how loud he was talking until friends later recounted word for word his response to her statement. "Why are you doing this now? I mean, we talked about it. We made plans for prom and all night, don't you remember? We're getting married as soon as you graduate in a couple years. I'll wait for you for as long as it takes." The look on his face made some of the boys uncomfortable, and most of the girls wanted to comfort him. Marcy apparently anticipated his questions. "Well, for one thing, we've never met any other people. I want to see what else is out there. You're going to graduate, and I'm going to stay here for another 2 years. Jimmy can keep me company while you study. I just figured I'd start dating now instead of waiting for you to leave. Besides, Jimmy's the starting quarterback and you're just a halfback. He could very well be homecoming king, and I know you won't even want to run. I might just become prom queen with him." Chuck was completely out of his depth. His best friend, his girlfriend, his future wife was sitting here in a sweater with his letter and class ring and acting like they were just acquaintances who happened to meet. They had grown up together. Both his parents and her parents had told him to look out for her. He walked her to school when she was just starting school, and was so scared that she clung to his arm all the way to and from school for days until she got the hang of it. They kissed each other for the first time. They dated, they went to Low Country Point. There was no one else, and Marcy had never talked about not wanting a change until today, in front of the whole school. He lowered his head in defeat. Any scene here would make him look weak. He took a deep breath. "I think you have a point. Since you're making such plans, I think you should give me back the sweater with the letter and the ring." At the same time, he removed the necklace and tossed it on the table in front of her. "Wait a minute. I'm not breaking up with you. We're still together. What's more, we have a date set for Friday night. We're going to the movies with Sandy and Jeff. No, we're not. What the hell? Keep the sweater and the ring. I'm not going to wear them anyway since they're ruined. He turned, walked out of the cafeteria, and headed straight for his car. Even though it was forbidden, he got in his car, praying that it would start since many of his classmates had come out to see what he would do, started it, and when it started, drove into the gravel parking lot and drove off in a cloud of dust. He went to the farm and began chopping wood for the stove his uncle and aunt continued to use. Then he let loose tears of frustration and anger. He couldn't let anyone know how deeply he was hurt. He just hoped Marcy would have a bad time at the ball and in front of him. His wish came true. When he got home that night, his mom informed him that Marcy had called. He shrugged and went to his room. Later, his mom came to his door and asked what was going on. Mom, I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't know this, but Marcy has decided to date Jimmy Willis and is going to prom with him. She didn't tell me anything until this afternoon. I've had no reason to talk to her since then. Of course, this did not please Beulah Newmeyer. While she could sympathize with her son, she knew that Marcy was a good girl and destined to marry Chuck. She and Marcy's mother were best friends, and their families had been close since the children were young. She tried to get Chuck to at least talk to Marcy on the phone. Chuck stubbornly refused. The next morning at school, Chuck felt even more alone. He was so used to Marcy sitting next to him in the car that he kept looking at an empty seat because he had gone to school a little earlier than usual so he wouldn't have to see her unloving face. At school, 3 different girls approached him and offered to go to prom. They weren't even the less cute ones from the graduating class, who one would expect to throw themselves into the fray for the chance to get a prom date. No, they were all cheerleaders and friends of Marcy's. He thanked them and said he'd respond to them later in the day. Just then, one of his guy friends came over, patted him on the back, and dragged him over to a small group of other classmates who were ready to go beat the crap out of Jimmy Willis, even though he was their senior quarterback. Chuck talked them into leaving Jimmy alone. He realized that Marcy had made the decision, and Jimmy was just taking advantage of her need to expand her horizons a little sooner than he had anticipated. He had already come to the conclusion weeks earlier that she would likely date him while he was in college. Just before classes started, Marcy caught up with him. She was furious. "What's the matter with you? I had to ask my mom to drive me to school this morning. She kept saying she's abandoned you. I'm not dumping you, dummy. It's just one date, not a commitment. What makes you think I'm telling everyone I'm dumping you for Jimmy Willis?" She grabbed his shirt for some reason and tried to slap him. She had to anticipate the look on his face and the force of the blow so her hand wouldn't hit his face. Now he was mad as hell at her. "What did you expect, dropping that bomb on me a couple weeks before prom? Prom is the damn dance of the year according to you. This is my last prom since I'll be attending college after this one. You'll have 2 more prom dates, and you can go to them with whoever you want." He felt like swearing, but it wasn't customary at that moment. "I'll also remind you that we had plans not only for the dance, but afterward as well. We've discussed it and worked on it for years. Now you will go with Jimmy, and as far as I know, you will bless him with your favor after the dance. I know it won't be with me. Whether you agree or not, when you told me you were going to the ball, it ended our relationship. You broke up with me. It also means you have to suffer the consequences of your action. I hope you don't get another date offer all year, including this summer. I'm also happy to tell you that 3 girls asked me to prom this morning. There may be more afterward. I don't know." He let go of the hand he was holding to keep from punching. "My parents raised me to believe that hitting a woman is wrong. They also raised me to believe that I shouldn't be hit by a woman. Try hitting me again and I'll forget what they taught me." He turned away abruptly while she was still talking about how they were still together. Gritting his heart, he walked into the classroom and sat down in a seat with the rest of the gang, away from the rest of the girls who were wide-eyed and ears wide open, waiting to find out all the dirt. He didn't notice Jimmy Willis walk up to Marcy in the hallway and tell her he wasn't going to take her to the prom, because all the girls in his class were telling him what a boor he was. Chuck went to prom with one of the cheerleaders, Janie. It was a nice experience, but not what he wanted. Marcy attended as well, but she had to convince her cousin to take her along. No one wanted to sit next to them, and the other girls caught her in the restroom after the banquet and told her everything they thought of her. Marcy didn't enjoy prom as much as Chuck did. The summer after graduation, Chuck stood his ground even though Marcy kept trying to win him back. He was humble enough to acknowledge her and didn't refuse to attend the general events his parents insisted he attend. He just didn't ask her out anymore. That fall, after working all summer on the farm, he left for school 100 miles away. At that time, the highways were still mostly gravel, so driving was difficult. It took him half a day to drive to the town where the school was located. He only planned to return home for the vacations. It was a 2-year college, and he was studying construction technology. And during his studies, he would come home for Christmas vacation and then again for spring break. During summer vacation, he had an internship with a large construction company, so he didn't come home until Memorial Day since it fell on a Friday and gave him a 3-day weekend. On the 4th of July, he was home again for just 1 day to see the big public fireworks display. He drove all night to return to work the next day. He was home again on Labor Day since it fell on a Monday that year. Every time he was home, Marcy tried to get him to talk to her. She was lonely because no guy would ask her out, except for the jerks in class who thought she was a promiscuous woman. The other girls were forbidden by their parents to have anything to do with her because she was spoiled. Chuck was polite and said, "Hi," but it was nothing more than that. He dated a few girls in college, but he wasn't serious about any of them. The next year went smoothly, with Chuck only coming home for vacations. After graduation, he accepted an offer from Chase Construction and got to work. Marcy finally put up with the gossip and ostracism. Jimmy Willis returned and asked her out on a date his senior year of high school. They dated all the time, but not as a couple. He genuinely liked her, so they kept dating, and he was her chaperone to the prom, even though he himself had graduated the year before. He didn't go to school because his father owned the local Chevy dealership and was sure he'd get a job that didn't require a college degree. When Chuck moved back to Crocketville, he rented a small apartment and didn't see Marcy much. He dated a few different women, but everything was the same. There just wasn't the connection he had enjoyed with Marcy all those years ago. He realized he needed to move on, but he wasn't in a hurry. After graduating from high school, Marcy decided to enroll in the local secretarial school. After taking all those courses, she decided to take a class in office management. This took 2 years to complete. During this time, Chuck would meet Marcy at the grocery store or department store. Now he could stand and talk to her for long periods of time. At first, their conversations were about acquaintances who were still in town. Later, their conversations became more personal and were accompanied by comments like, "Do you remember when we—" Marcy had her own agenda, which Chuck didn't realize until later. She used these casual conversations to remind him of the good times they'd had together, as well as their friendship. If he started to treat those memories without rancor, maybe they could get back to what she had wanted all along. She never wanted him to leave her. She just allowed herself some freedom. She was insanely jealous of him for any woman who even looked at him. That double standard had reappeared years later. Now, sitting at the bar and reflecting on his past with Marcy, Chuck saw how she had carefully manipulated him to get her way. He didn't regret it, as he himself had wanted to be manipulated on more than one occasion. He tipped the next shot glass into himself and gestured for another. When he was served, he took another deep drag of bourbon and continued to go over his memories. He remembered eventually asking her out again. They went to a movie and then to a coffee shop for coffee. They talked about the movie and what all its symbolism was about. They laughed when they realized that their poor English teacher back in high school had tried to get them to do that with movies and books, but never understood anything. They had a great time. Chuck almost believed that Marcy was just an immature schoolgirl when she offended him. They made plans for more dates. Soon they were a full-fledged couple again. It was 1960. The new decade was filled with hope. World War II and Korea were just subjects for movies that competed for earned dollars among romantic comedies, westerns, and musicals. Most movies were now shot in full color and with stereo sound. This was very different from the small black and white TV screens with a small speaker that was sometimes hard to make out. As they grew closer together, they stayed home more often. They made new friends and had card parties, played charades, and sometimes even board games. Finally, Chuck asked Marcy to marry him, and she immediately agreed. The wedding preparations were quite different. Chuck found a lot on the outskirts of town, and they built a house they could afford. It was a simple ranch-style house with a basement. However, Chuck saw the basement as a potential living space, not as storage space, which was the norm. He planned for larger windows and a higher ceiling. He also opted for that newfangled thing called central air conditioning. When construction began, he was involved in all areas. He helped with site preparation and digging the basement. Shaping the basement floor and foundations was his responsibility. This was followed by the pouring of concrete. After the concrete set, blocks were laid. Chuck would come in the evenings after a full day of other work to lay 2 blocks as his contribution to the construction of the house. He helped erect the floor, then the walls. Every part of the house he was involved in. He even helped install the drains for the tubs, sinks, and toilets. The final finishing was done by him a few days before the wedding. They planned to have a short honeymoon, a week at a large resort in the mountains and then move into their new home. Chuck never asked Marcy about what happened during her bachelorette party, but he was a little embarrassed by it. The construction workers got together and had their own party. In the morning, Chuck woke up with a bad hangover. He was lying on the couch in the lobby. Most of the others seemed to be in the same state as well. Slowly trying to become part of life again, they all agreed that it had been one hell of a party. Their wedding had gone off without too much trouble. Relatives came from everywhere. Both mothers were thrilled that the couple had overcome their previous slip-up and gotten married. Those were exciting times. They were married in 1961. Their daughter Rebecca, Becky to her family and friends, was born in 1963. They survived the death of the president. Marcy cried all night the day he was shot and all day the day of his funeral. In 1965, a son was born to the couple. They named him John. He was a beautiful child, loved by his mother and father, grandparents and sister. Then came a day of absolute terror and grief. One morning when John was 6 months old, he was found cold and motionless in his crib. Marcy had been destroyed. Chuck felt he had to be strong and not show how much he was destroyed by his son's death. He was the rock that everyone could rely on. He was the one who had to try to explain to the 2-year-old why her little brother was no longer lying in his crib. The doctors couldn't explain why John was taken away. They called it crib death. There was no other explanation. The doctors didn't want to talk about it. Apparently, they didn't like to admit that they had no idea what had happened. Marcy wondered if it was her fault. Chuck wondered if she should have taken John to the doctor more often. Marcy wondered why Chuck didn't seem as concerned as she was. He didn't even return to work until a couple days after the funeral, leaving her alone to care for Becky. She returned to work a couple weeks later. Relatives kept asking what had happened. No one knew the answers. The day he died, police responded to an emergency call. There was no 911 service then, just dialing 0 inches and asking for emergency services. The cops seemed to think Marcy and Chuck had done something wrong, but couldn't pin anything on them. Even years later, anytime there was any contact with law enforcement, the officer would check something and suddenly the attitude would change and become very aggressive. Now, thinking back to that incident, Chuck sees that things had changed a bit then. Marcy became less and less interested in their sex life. Then came the disaster called Vietnam. Friends were leaving and dying there. Even those who survived were changed forever. The population treated them horribly. We went to the moon. A great moment in time. Before that, a space capsule burned up on the moon pad. Another one almost didn't make it back and didn't complete its mission. At least 3 crew members made it home safely. The Russians and Americans met in space and shook hands. The president resigned in disgrace. Inflation was huge and unemployment was high. And free love was the watchword of the day for the younger generation. Chuck had a hard time understanding them. Woodstock was a success that was legendary, but it was also not to be repeated as a huge unplanned event. There was a new method of birth control, the pill, which immediately gained popularity. Women could now do it with multiple partners without fear of an unplanned pregnancy. With the legalization of abortion, even unplanned pregnancies could be dealt with. Chuck felt increasingly disconnected from the modern world. Their daughter was preparing to enter junior high school. He was always there for her. He attended her school events. And there was now an adult movie theater in the center of town in place of one of the regular movie theaters. But well-meaning people didn't visit such places. There was even an adult bookstore next to the movie theater. Again, a place that no decent person would turn up dead in. Marcy had put on a little weight during her pregnancy, but neither Chuck nor Marcy cared. Chuck still loved her with the same intensity he had before. In his eyes, she was still the girl he had fallen in love with. Chuck had put on a few pounds too, but his job was physically demanding, so he kept himself in better shape. Marcy was now her boss's personal assistant. It was a new position. At first, it was just a simple secretary, but then she became very necessary in the business world. Both were making good money. Chuck still brought in the bulk of the income, but Marcy's contribution was not chicken feed. Their house was mostly paid off, and that was going to be before Becky graduated from high school. Money was being set aside for her education, and they hoped she would be able to qualify for grants and scholarships since she wanted to become a doctor. They were proud of their daughter, but deep down, they were still grieving for John. They didn't fall into the trap of trying to keep up with the Joneses. They didn't change their house every few years like some of their contemporaries. Their house payments were small, which helped them survive the years of high inflation. Their cars were paid off and continued to run smoothly. About the time Becky was due to graduate from high school, they bought a camper and traveled every summer. Chuck and Marcy also avoided one of the traps that many people fell into. Most couples their age fell into 2 main groups. One group sought extramarital thrills, and the other group sat at home, watched TV, and slowly sank into oblivion. They continued to go out to dinner and movies, occasionally dancing and meeting other couples. They continued to discuss current events, their work, their daughter, and her activities. Chuck told Marcy he loved her every morning as they went about their business and every evening before he went to sleep. Marcy echoed Chuck unreservedly each time. Becky graduated from high school with honors, soon went to a 4-year college to get her bachelor's degree, and worked at a nursing home to earn money. She was a sweet young woman. She dated a few guys in high school, but didn't seem ready for a serious relationship. Maybe after medical school, they decided. Chuck felt no pain as he finished his reflections on the earlier years, his relationship with Marcy and his daughter. They had quietly celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary the year Becky graduated from high school. They paid more attention to her accomplishments. Each year, they celebrated the anniversary with a dinner at an expensive restaurant. Gifts to each other were thoughtful and lovingly chosen. Although Chuck had his own secretary, he never let her pick out gifts for Marcy. Unlike Marcy's boss, who wanted Marcy to pick out every gift he gave her. Chapter 2. The Anniversary Party. Becky had received her medical degree and was waiting for her placement letter. Since it was the year of her parents' 25th wedding anniversary, she planned a big party to mark the occasion. Many of their older friends never made it to the age of 25, so the celebration was even more necessary. They had overcome all the challenges. They still loved each other. Chuck paused in his musings and took a sip. He was feeling dizzy. It was hard to focus on recent events. Those events hurt the most. Not since John's death, not even after his parents' deaths in years, had he felt so alone and in such acute pain. Chuck suddenly wanted to get up and leave the bar. He was starting to choke. He needed to get out for some fresh air before he got sick. As he reached the door, he stumbled and almost fell. "No, not here," he shouted under his breath. "I must go out. I have to be alone. I can't break down here." He managed to open the heavy door. It didn't seem so heavy when he walked in. He staggered away from the bar and the lights of the parking lot. There was darkness outside. Blessed darkness. It matched the darkness in his soul. No matter how drunk he was, he couldn't stop thinking about the celebration. It was scheduled for their anniversary. Becky was very adamant about it. The fact that it fell on a Saturday seemed like divine providence. All their friends and remaining relatives were able to attend. The meeting began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and was to last several hours. Becky decided that light refreshments would be provided along with a large cake. There would be beer and liquor for those who wanted it. After all, this was a celebration. Marcy started the day with a few drinks while still in the house. She was in a real holiday mood. By the time the open house started, she was feeling no more pain and strutted around the hall greeting people. Her boss and his current wife were there, as well as Billy Chase and his wife, who was in a wheelchair. Many of Chuck's co-workers were there, as well as Marcy and many people from their church. It was nice to see so many people who held this couple in high esteem. Becky brought out old photo albums and spread out pictures of the happy couple for all to see. There were pictures of her from infancy to adulthood. There were also a few pictures of John. Almost everyone knew about their loss. It had never been kept secret, so there were few questions about the baby pictures. There was an open mic, so people could talk about some of the humorous and sometimes embarrassing moments in the happy couple's lives. No one mentioned Chuck's prom. Even Becky had never heard of that major blunder of her mother's. Walking, or rather stumbling, down the unkept sidewalk, Chuck didn't notice that there were no buildings in the area. It was dark, and that made him feel better. He fell a couple times but got up. The alcohol was starting to confuse his thoughts. What day was today? Could it really be Sunday? Was hell really over? Chuck kept walking and reminiscing. At the end of the chatter, both Marcy and Chuck were invited to talk. Chuck only had a few words to say. He thanked everyone for coming. He then thanked Becky for organizing the event. He then turned to Marcy. "Marcy, you are the one and only love of my life. Without you, I am not a complete person. In fact, without you and Becky, I would be just a shell of a person." He raised a toast to everyone and drank the last glass of champagne. Marcy stood up. She was unsteady on her feet, but her words were easily picked up by the microphone. She stuttered a little before whispering her comment. "What a load of crap. Talking a lot of shit about a man who thinks he's a great lover. Andy should be here instead." She slowly lowered herself into the chair again. The room became as quiet as a graveyard. Everyone who knew him looked at the man sitting at the end of the room. Andrew, Cornings was trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. One of the women sitting next to him stood up and slapped him. "You bastard," she said, and walked out. Becky was already heading toward her mother when she heard the accusatory words come out of her mouth. She stopped at the edge of the stage and began to cry. Chuck was caught off guard. At first, he completely disregarded what he heard. There was not the slightest hint that Marcy had any thoughts, let alone a physical relationship, with anyone but him. Chuck sat down at a table some distance away from his wife. The men with red faces suddenly remembered that they needed to be somewhere else. Marcy's boss shook his head, looking at his assistant. There would be a charge on Monday. He looked at Mr. Cornings's receding back. "Yes, Monday will pay for that." Billy Chase walked up to Chuck. He said something, but Chuck didn't understand anything. He was still trying to understand what had happened in his life. Until a few minutes ago, he had been happy. Now he didn't know when he would be happy again. Billy gave up and pushed his wife out to their car. He would talk to Chuck on Monday. Becky finally shook her head, blew her nose, and went to her mother, who was now in La La Land. Marcy rarely drank, and she would have to pay for today in many ways. Becky cast a glance at her father. He sat as if in a fog, but physically he looked fine. She called for help from a couple of her male cousins, and the two picked her aunt up in their arms and carried her to the car. From the look on their faces, Becky thought they wished they could shove her under the car instead of in it. The relatives all thought Chuck was a great guy, and certainly didn't deserve this humiliation. And the rest of the relatives helped clean up the mess and tried to leave Chuck alone. They noticed him get up and head to the bathroom, but they didn't see him go out the fire exit next to the bathroom. Chuck got in his car and drove off to find the nearest dive. Tears streamed down Chuck's face as he continued to stumble on the unfamiliar sidewalk. He replayed over and over in his head Marcy's confession and the fact that she chose her boyfriend over her husband. Chuck had always thought of himself as a good man, a good father, a good husband, and probably not a bad lover. With no feedback from his only lover, his wife, how could he improve or change? Was he really that bad? If so, then how could he be an average Joe, a father, or a loving husband? Hell, what was the point of his life then? He fell again and couldn't get up for a long time. He had no idea where he was, and frankly, he didn't care. Finally, he got up just as the headlights illuminated him. It was a patrolling city cop. He stopped and asked Chuck if he needed help. Chuck didn't answer. The bell rang and several other police officers responded. The first officer began to examine our hero. He smelled of stale alcohol. His clothes were of good quality, but worn and torn from the fall. There were abrasions on his face and arms from falling and trying to get up. Additional officers cordoned off the scene and began searching for the cause of the victim. Chuck was not responding well to questions. He was confused, and his head seemed full of absorbent cotton. He couldn't focus on the police officers, and they kept asking questions without giving him time to formulate an answer. The city didn't have an ordinance against public drunkenness, and the jail no longer had a drunk tank, so the cops had limited options. Chuck's driver's license was found after a brief struggle with his wallet. He was at least a couple miles from his home address, if that was correct. They asked the dispatcher to call his address, but there was no answer. What they, and then Chuck, didn't know was that Becky had brought her mother home and put her in bed, then left to try to find Chuck. Marcy was too drunk to pay attention to the phone, so the call went unanswered. Since no one in the house answered, the cops had no choice but to call an ambulance. A fire department vehicle arrived on the scene 5 minutes later. The sleepy paramedics were not thrilled to have another drunk on their shift. It was already 3 in the morning, and they had only managed to sleep an hour between calls. They quickly picked Chuck up and put him in the back seat of the car. Chuck kept repeating that his wife didn't love him. When asked about the pain, he just mumbled about his broken heart. When asked about the abrasions, he looked at his hands as if he had never seen them before and shrugged. They might have hurt later, but his depression was a bigger problem. They went to the hospital where Chuck had been born 50 years before. On the way, the paramedic sitting in the back asked Chuck again what had happened to cause him to be so far from his home. When he named the bar he was at, the paramedic was amazed. Chuck had been found almost a mile from the bar and very close to his home. On the way to the hospital, Chuck asked the young paramedic if he was married. The paramedic answered in the affirmative. Chuck asked if his wife loved him. The paramedic replied that she did, since they had a couple of young children. He was surprised when Chuck started laughing. That doesn't mean she loves you. I have a couple kids and my wife doesn't love me. He repeated this all the way to the hospital. At the hospital, the paramedics led Chuck to the emergency room and laid him on a bed. He lay down and closed his eyes because of the bright lights. He felt like he wanted darkness again. He heard one paramedic trying to explain to him what had happened. It was close enough to the truth that Chuck didn't feel the need to explain again. He tried to go back to sleep, but soon a nurse measured his pulse and blood pressure and then went to the doctor. The doctor asked him about the events, and he repeated everything, but this time he cried again. He didn't know if he had sobered up, but he couldn't explain himself any better than to keep trying to make someone realize that Marcy didn't love him. The nurse washed his scratches and bandaged them. Then she told him that they had tried to contact his family, but there had been no response. Chuck only nodded dumbly. Further proof that Marcy didn't love him. She was probably having fun with that asshole Andy, whatever his name was. He couldn't remember the asshole's last name. Then they turned off the lights and left the room. Chuck fell asleep for a while. He woke up when he felt movement in the room. The room was still dark, but he could make out the silhouette of the nurse who came in and examined him. His head cleared up a little, but it ached. When she left the room, he stood up. He needed to get going. If Becky was worried, she could visit him at the hospital. He didn't want to see anyone he knew for a while. He was too humiliated to even make eye contact with his own daughter. And he certainly didn't want to see Marcy. All the feelings he'd experienced when she'd dumped him before graduation were back. She needed someone else, but she didn't want to let him go. So let her boy toy be her boy toy. He can't be more than 30 years old. He'd be more Becky's age. He looked like a gigolo. Maybe he was. He was young and tanned. His hair was bleached, like he was a surfer or something, even though they were hundreds of miles from the ocean. Chuck looked out the door. There was no one in the hallway, so he quickly headed for the exit and was soon outside. It was still dark, but there was a glimmer of light in the east. Soon the sun would rise, and the darkness he craved would be banished for a few hours. He wanted to find darkness, curl up, and die. Chuck walked down the sidewalk to the street where, luckily, a cab was passing, and he caught it. He didn't know the address of the bar where his car was parked, but he remembered the name, and the cabbie knew it well. 15 minutes later, he was standing outside his car in the parking lot of the closed bar. As he was about to go inside, he saw a familiar car drive down the street. Since the parking lot lights were out, Becky couldn't see her father or his car. Chuck waited for it to pass, opened the door, and got out of the car. Soon he was on his way out of town. The capital was only a couple hours away, and he could get there and lay low for a while. He needed more alcohol and a place to lay around. All too soon, the sun was fully up, and he was already on the outskirts of town. He found a motel near the bar and parked. He wasn't completely sober yet, but he was too sober for what he needed. Next to the bar was a store that sold packages. He didn't even need to talk to people. He could just grab a bottle of his favorite color and stay inside in the dark. He did just that. He bought enough and paid enough in cash that no one would bother him for a week. He drank, fell down, threw up, woke up, drank, fell down, threw up, woke up, and so it went on until the booze ran out, and he just couldn't work up the courage to cross the street again. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd come to the party in. He stank to high heaven, even to himself. There was vomit everywhere in the room. It was on the walls, on the bed, on the floor, in the shower, on the curtain, and everywhere except, I think, the toilet. God, it smelled so awful. It made his stomach cramp all the time. That last day, he got up off the floor and went into the shower. He slowly stood up to his full height and began to undress as the water cascaded down. He had no plans for the future except to get back to work. His only thought of his wife was insidious plans to hurt her like she had hurt him. Right now, he had no idea how to respond. After all, she didn't need Chuck anymore. She'd made that clear on their silver anniversary. He needed a place to stay. He wasn't going into the house he'd built for her while she lived there. Maybe she would move in with Andrew, the god of love? No, she wasn't that forward-thinking. With the house paid for, she could manage the expenses on her paycheck, and after all, he had built it for her. No, she thought she deserved this house and everything in it. Heck, she might be against giving him his own clothes. She might keep it out of spite. After all, he was a complete lowlife both in and out of bed. After undressing and trying to scrub his clothes off with a small bar of soap, he rinsed himself off and stepped out of the shower. He hung his clothes out to dry and then tried to wash away some of the vomit. He tossed the bottles that no longer contained his new most favorite color into the trash can, a boon that was overflowing. He opened the windows to let in some fresh air. He reminded himself to tip the cleaners when they came to clean up, as the job was going to be horrible. After a few hours, his underwear, pants, and shirt were dry enough to put on. He went outside and picked up a newspaper. He couldn't remember what city he was in. He was surprised to see that he was in the capital, and it had been a whole week. So he went and found a cafe to eat at and a cheap clothing store to buy new outfits. When he got back to his room, he was surprised to see that the staff had already cleaned up. When he checked, he found that they had also asked the maintenance men to bring in a new mattress. Their tips were growing by the second. He checked his cash and found that he still had a few hundred left, as well as a rarely used credit card. He decided he would have to use the card to pay this bill. Since he was already on his feet, he called his boss on the long-distance phone. Billy was glad to hear from him and didn't seem too upset about missing a whole week of work. "Listen, son, I understand what you're going through. Before you came to work for me, Millie was having an affair. She was so damn attractive then, and she knew it. I had a hell of a time with her for a while, but she finally came around after I went on a bender and disappeared for a month. She was so worried that I might have done something to myself that she finally realized what an asshole she was. She finally accepted the program, and we've been good ever since." He paused. "Have you called home yet?" Chuck was frank. "I don't have a home right now. If you mean have I talked to Marcy, the answer is no. I have no reason to talk to her at any time." Billy didn't bother urging him to change his mind. "Please call Becky. She calls every day to see if you've checked in and come back. She's frantic. And by the way, so is Marcy. She called me and Millie too and cried about how she didn't mean to hurt you." Now Chuck was alert enough to snort in disgust. "Yeah, I bet she didn't mean to hurt me. Just like the last time she decided to step out of line and do what she wanted. She said the same phrase to me then. Sometimes it takes time to learn a lesson, but I've learned it now." They talked about work. Chuck promised to be back on Monday, ready to work. Billy told him to take his time. He already had vacation time. Chuck reflected that he was going to use his vacation to take Marcy on a cruise. Fortunately, he hadn't contacted a travel agent yet and planned it. "Look, Billy, it's costing me a tidy sum, so I'm letting you go. If you hear from Becky, tell her I'm okay. But I'll try to get her on the phone sooner and tell her myself. Goodbye." He hung up and dialed Becky's apartment number. She didn't answer, but she had an answering machine, so he left a message saying he was okay and would be back in town in a few days. He would call her then. He did not call home as he had no reason to talk to his wife. This was a problem that would have to be dealt with soon. Ever since she had spit on their marriage vows, he no longer felt obligated to honor them. He went into the office and paid a few more days' rent. He also apologized to the manager for the way he had left the room and gave the manager a tip to pass on to the staff. That made the manager's job a little easier. This was not a chain motel, but a single mom-and-pop motel, and he was struggling with the reputation of being a rundown establishment. Being drunk puking everywhere didn't help, but apologizing did. Chuck drove to the center of town. He got out of the car and started looking at the storefronts. At first glance, he was looking at the storefronts, but he was actually looking for a streetwalker. He wandered the streets for several hours. Since it was daylight, the selection might have been a bit sparse. After eating lunch at a sandwich stand, he continued exploring possible teachers. Finally, on a corner, away from the main business district, near more rundown houses, a few apartment buildings, and small businesses, he saw a few women standing on the corner waiting. The way they just stood on the corner talking to passing motorists and pedestrians told him that the educators he was looking for were the ones in front of him. Me bad, eh? One of the girls turned to look at his 50-something figure with graying hair. It must not have hit her too hard, for she immediately spoke. "Hey, sailor, how's the weather?" He smiled at her. She turned out to be one of the older women. She looked a little stern, as if her life hadn't been too easy. He supposed it was, since she worked here during the day, competing with younger talent. She had no cloak of darkness to help her hide her years. "You know, the weather is pretty good for this time of year. It could be a lot warmer than it is right now." "So, sailor, why did you come to town?" Well, actually, I'm looking for a teacher. Now, all the women on the corner were looking at Chuck. The first woman continued to speak. A teacher, you say? What kind of teacher are you looking for? She made a movement to encompass everyone standing there. I don't know if any of us can be considered a teacher. Chuck lowered his head in embarrassment. He decided it was best to tell the truth. A week ago, my wife told me and anyone else who heard anything that I was nothing in bed and couldn't satisfy a woman. I looked into the matter and decided that I needed lessons. To that end, I decided I needed a professional to take the time to teach me. She laughed along with the other women. I assume she gave you permission to take lessons so you could benefit from it. Chuck shook his head. No, in fact, she announced, as she did to me, to family and friends, that she had already replaced me in her bed. No, that's what I want to do for myself and any future partner. So, are any of you interested in taking this job? The women gathered together and whispered briefly. Finally, one of the younger girls asked a question. Where will this training, as you call it, take place? Chuck replied that he had a car in the parking lot downtown and that they would go to his motel and named the motel. They reconvened. Finally, one of the women spoke up. Look, Slick, you seem honest, but let's be realistic. More than one of us has taken a ride in a car and not come back. Ending up on the shore of a lake or being found in a junkyard is wrong, even if we are whores. The woman who had approached Chuck spoke up as well. We don't have much, honey, but we have a life, and we don't want to lose that last bit of ourselves. Chuck hesitated. He could understand their reluctance. Do you have a pimp? They shook their heads. No, and we don't need one. One of the girls showed Chuck a small gun, and the other pulled out a knife. This is to keep them away. We're not trying to work the popular corners, and they don't bother us. There's no percentage for them. We pool our money. Someday, we'll get out of this business. The older prostitute introduced herself as Sylvia. She was at least 50 years old, dyed hair and false nails. The youngest was named Tiffany and had dark hair. The other two introduced themselves as Mandy and Grace. They were in their early 30s. Chuck returned to his original question. Are you ready to help me, or should I look elsewhere? They spoke again. Chuck interrupted them. How about this? I'll hire 2 or 3 of you as my instructors. I'll drive to the motel and you meet me there. Bring with you everything you need to teach me everything a woman would want to know from a man and whatever defenses you deem necessary to be safe with me. At the appointed time, there was a knock on the motel door. Chuck opened it and greeted the 4 women. When he woke up in the morning, he was fully prepared to be alone. After all, these were the professional ladies of the evening. They had no loyalty other than the money he had promised them. Looking up, he saw Tiffany, Sylvia, and Mandy. Chapter 3. Coming Home. After that, he left them and went to check out of the motel. The cleaning lady smiled at him. He didn't know if it was because of the tip he left the staff or because the room was pretty clean. From his room, he made one last long-distance call to Becky. This time, she was home. Daddy, when are you coming home? Mom is really worried about you. She doesn't remember what happened at the anniversary, but a bunch of people made sure she knew what she was saying. She loves you and wants you home. Chuck snorted over the phone. Yeah, right. As for going home, I'm leaving here now and will be back in town in a couple hours. I'm not going to the house. It's your mother's house, not mine. I believe she was telling the truth at the party and meant every hurtful word she said. That's what alcohol can do. Tell the truth. I'm also willing to bet that Andy has come to comfort her at least once in the last week. Becky got angry at her father. Dad, she says she never cheated on you and that it was all a mistake. Mr. Cornings is just a personal trainer at the new gym Mom went to last month to get back into better shape. She just never told you about the gym or her membership. Well, now that explains a lot. By the way, if he's the personal trainer she met last month, why was he at our party? I don't think he could make that kind of impression on a woman in such a short period of time and wouldn't even think of attending a party like this where he doesn't know more than one person. No, I'm guessing she wasn't just meeting him for personal training. She was right when she said I was a loser in bed. I think she was looking for someone who wasn't a wastrel, and she found him. Before she could respond, he told her he had to go and that the long-distance bill was going to be exorbitant. When he hung up, she was still hissing. He was right. The motel charged a hefty fee for long-distance calls from the room. He paid and headed for the exit. He had Sylvia's home phone number in his wallet. When he got a new number, he could call her and make arrangements for his further education. On the way out, he pondered where he would be living in the near future, starting tonight. Since it was Sunday, no real estate offices would be open, and he would be able to see where he could rent. Tomorrow promised to be a busy day, as he would need to make inquiries on websites, since he had been away for a whole week. He didn't want to be stuck in a motel for a few more days. It wasn't bad, but it seemed a bit of a cheesy way to live right now. Suddenly, a thought struck him. They had bought a recreational vehicle, an RV that was self-contained. He could pick it up from storage, drive it to a campground or trailer park, and hook it up to utilities. He wondered if the campground had electricity that could be hooked up to. In the end, he decided that the best place to go would be a trailer park that definitely had electricity, water and sewer, and a phone line. After picking up the van, he discovered he couldn't rent a spot at the trailer park on Sunday, so he went to a local campground and parked for the night. By cab, he returned to the storage facility to retrieve his car. After buying some groceries, he settled in for the night. The mattress was good, and he got a good night's sleep. In the morning, he woke up, showered, shaved, and put on his normal clothes to go to work. His plan was to start the workday and then try to sneak into the house and pick up some things while Marcy was at work. He could take care of other personal matters, but right now he had to go to work at Chase Construction. When he arrived, Billy called him into the office. "Well, son, that was a whole different party we all attended. Even though I've been through the same things you have, I've never had to flaunt it in front of family and friends. I will tell you that Marcy seems to be very upset. She calls every day and asks if she's heard from you. Of course, for the past week, I could honestly tell her I have no idea where you are. You scared me too, my boy. I think of you as a son, and the fact that you're so out of sorts alarms me. Where did you go?" Billy, I was definitely out of sorts. That first night I got drunk as hell and walked. I ended up in the ambulance when the cops and firemen couldn't help me. I sobered up and drove to the Capitol. Nah. Chuck then went on to talk about the next week of drunken nonsense and even admitted how bad his life was, barfing and all. He didn't bother to let his boss know how he spent the weekend after sobering up. That was his and only his business. Billy understood. He told him that when his wife had done bad things to him, he had stayed drunk for a month. After he was arrested for vagrancy, he finally sobered up. That's when the police contacted his wife to see if she would post bail. She immediately did so, and then came and picked him up. She then took him away for a week to show him how badly she had treated him. It took a long time before he finally forgave her, and he believes she still hasn't forgiven herself. Her need for a wheelchair and physical assistance kept her from feeling completely forgiven for her sins. I understand, Billy, but you are describing a situation where you found out about the affair and just disappeared. The rest of your family and friends didn't get punched in the face on one of the most highly anticipated anniversaries of a relationship. I find no forgiveness for her sin of timing when she announced it. It was hardly worse than the initial violation of our marriage vows. In fact, I personally think her embarrassment is more due to her announcement than her affair. I think she thinks she deserves her lover and that I should just stand by or, better yet, turn a blind eye to her activities. No, 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 that's not going to happen. Now I need to get back to work, if you don't mind. It's all I have left, and I intend to throw all my energies into it. It's either work or drinking, and I can't drink all day every day just to try to forget what she did to me. Billy patted him on the back and nodded in agreement. I understand. You have to do what's right for you. I'm only sorry your family will never be together again after this. Chuck allowed himself another comment. I'm coming to the conclusion that my family hasn't been together in over 20 years. We stopped communicating on the level we needed to after my son died. I think it just took us this long to finally get it over with. I'm sorry it will affect my relationship with my daughter, but I'll do my best to minimize the damage. He turned toward the door. After I check in with the crew, I need time to find a lawyer and also get my stuff. I don't have a phone right now, so I'll be hard to reach. Billy snapped his fingers. I have what we need to keep in touch with you. I rented some pagers a few weeks ago. He rummaged through some small boxes. Here you go. Carry these with you, and when I need to contact you, I'll call the number and leave a voice message. Then you will come to the phone and call me back. This is the phone number I will carry with me. Do the same if you can't reach me. He handed the piece of paper to Chuck, and Chuck tucked it away in his file folder. He did the paperwork for a while, but then informed the secretary that he was leaving for a while. He headed to a nearby construction site to check on the crew's work. When he arrived at the site, he found them all sitting idle. When he asked what was going on, one of the oldest members of the crew, and perhaps the most irritable, Butch, replied, "Well, boss, we heard you were going back to work today, so we thought we'd see if a wimp like you dared show up. After all, you can't make your woman happy and stay at home, so you must not be much of a man. And we all don't work for wimps." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "Well, that's new. So you all think I'm a wuss and not much of a man?" A few nodded, but most turned away. All of them, with few exceptions, had worked for him for several years. Butch had always challenged his leadership, but backed down when pressed. Chuck expected him to back down again, but Butch didn't seem inclined to do so. "As a matter of fact, boss, I've appointed myself foreman on this site. The men won't work until I say so." "Well, Mr. Foreman, how do you propose we get on with the work? If I tell you that you are dismissed, all of you, if you do not immediately return to work, what will happen then?" "I'm not obliged to take orders from weaklings, Chucky. When I decide we're going to work, then we'll work, and not necessarily when you want us to work." Chuck stepped closer to Butch. "Butch, we've had our little disagreements over the years, but we've always worked things out. I'd hate to see you in the unemployment line in these uncertain times. A lot of good construction workers are flipping hamburgers instead of getting a good paycheck. Are you sure you want to keep that up?" "I only work for someone when I respect them. After what we heard from your wife about your abilities in the bedroom, we don't respect any man who can't keep his woman under control." Chuck was very close to Butch. "So what's going to get your respect back?" Butch jerked back and laughed. "I don't know of anything that would make me respect you. You've proven you're not the kind of man who can make me do anything." "I guess I don't stand a chance. You are dismissed. Leave now before I call in a security team to drag your ass off the facility." Butch laughed and reached for Chuck at the same time. "Why don't you drag my ass off the site?" Chuck knew it was coming. That's why he came so close. A quick stab to the heart caused Butch to back up and try to catch his breath. Chuck motioned for him to follow. "When he can figure out what the hell is going on, tell him that if he apologizes, he'll be rehired. Otherwise, I can do this every day until he realizes." He turned to the rest of the crew. "Did anyone not understand the message?" Every person on the pad nodded in understanding. "Then get to work, or I'll fire you all. You get in my way, and I'll repeat the goddamn message. Do you understand?" Everyone obediently got up and went to work. They started slowly, but when they turned to look, Chuck was still standing in the same spot, staring at them intently. The work immediately sped up. Chuck looked at Butch and decided to call an ambulance for him. He would have to check on him later. He was a good man, just cocky. Chuck had been to other sites, but he only had to threaten to fire a couple people before work returned to normal. It was just part of the job. Now he was off to his old house. He needed some clothes and some toiletries. As he approached the house, he saw that the lawn needed maintenance. He shrugged his shoulders. It wasn't his problem now. Marcy's car wasn't there, so he didn't need to deal with her and her lies right now. That would have to wait for a while. He unlocked the front door instead of using the garage entrance. It seemed a little odd after all the years he'd entered the house through the garage. The house was a mess. Normally, Marcy kept the house in order, but here it looked like a hurricane had struck. There were piles of dishes on the countertops. Dirty pans cluttered the stove. Papers and clothes were strewn all over the floor. When he got to the bedroom, he found the same mess. Clothes were strewn all over the floor and the bed. Chuck didn't check to see if there was evidence of Marcy's infidelity in their bed, as he assumed she would move her boyfriend into the house so he could continue to give her the pleasure she felt she deserved. Walking over to the closet, he found his clothes still neatly hung. He grabbed a suitcase from the basement and quickly filled it with enough clothes to last a long time. He also put his favorite razor, shampoo, and soap in there. A toothbrush and toothpaste were added to the rest. He carried the full suitcase to the car. Then he went back down to the basement. This was his domain. The place was as neat as if he'd left it yesterday, not a week ago. He rummaged through his gun case and moved all the guns and ammo into the car. There were tools in the garage, but he didn't need them in the van. He took a small box of tools needed for quick repairs. Later, he might decide to buy a house, and then he would need more tools. He thought about throwing away anything he couldn't take today, so Mr. Cornings couldn't use them, but he hated the waste of time, so he left them. He went back into the house and checked to see if he would need anything in the near future. Finding nothing he needed, he took off his wedding ring and put it on the dresser in the bedroom. He put it in the change plate. There was still some change there that he had last raked out of his pockets before going to bed. Among the pennies and nickels, his ring didn't look so dreary. Leaving the house, he locked the door and headed toward the campground. On the way, he pondered how he could find out which gym Andrew Cornings worked at. Andrew needed to educate himself on the consequences of having fun with a married woman. He also needed to find a more permanent home for the camper, so he stopped at a convenience store and sat down at the phone book. Typing trailer parks into the directory, he found several to call, and then looked for gyms and found 4 that were in close proximity to Marcy's work and home. He figured she would be more likely to go to a gym in that direction rather than on the other side of town. He started calling around to various trailer parks. Several were reluctant to let the camper into their prestigious yards, but one was favorable and had a vacant lot. He arranged to move the camper in the morning. He would have to put blocks under it and come up with some sort of curbing, but that wasn't difficult for someone as experienced as he was. He also arranged for the telephone line and electricity to be hooked up. Water and sewer were brought into the trailer park. And then he called around the gyms looking for Mr. Cornings. He started with one that specialized in women-only classes and got a response from the first call. He explained why he was looking for Andrew, saying that a friend had recommended personal training to him. Andrew was put on the phone. Chuck gave a fake name and relayed the praise his fake friend showered on the young man. Andrew was so pleased that someone thought so well of him that he didn't even ask who exactly recommended him. Chuck arranged to meet him at a bar a block away from the gym after Andrew finished his shift. Chuck found the gym and parked so he could see the door. He didn't know if there was an employee entrance, but he didn't care. He'd deal with Andrew at the bar or in the parking lot. He just wondered if Marcy would stop by here on her way home from work. As he settled in for a potentially long wait, he realized why his pager was sometimes called a beeper. The alert tone sounded like a beep. He read the message, then walked over to a payphone on a nearby street and called Billy. His boss had heard about the fight at the construction site and just wanted to see how Chuck was doing. They talked for a while, and then Chuck walked back to his car. He didn't have to wait long. Marcy was already leaving. Andrew came out after her. They stood and talked for a while. Marcy seemed upset and kept shaking her head. Chuck looked at his wife carefully. She seemed to have lost a little weight. Perhaps the workouts had done some good. But she also looked sad and a little haggard. Marcy abruptly turned away from Mr. Cornings and headed for her car. Andrew turned and walked back into the house. He didn't have to finish his shift until 45 minutes later. Chuck sincerely hoped that seeing Andrew wouldn't keep his wife from having fun tonight. Chuck waited and then headed to the bar following Andrew. As soon as he walked through the door, he saw Andrew standing there looking around trying to get a glimpse of his potential client. Chuck knew he could be a formidable opponent, as he was in very good physical shape, so he glared at the man. Chuck walked over and kicked Andrew in the back of the knee, knocking the man down. The door opened just as new customers were coming in. Chuck squeezed past them, dragging the hapless man behind him. Some customers yelled at the man who had attacked a familiar face in their bar, but no one tried to stop Chuck. They seemed frozen in place. Chuck pulled Andrew around the corner of the building and let him go. Chuck leaned over to the face of his wife's lover. "This is just a gentle reminder for you to stop entertaining married women, asshole. Entertain the single ones instead. If any married woman comes on to you, tell her you're okay with it if her husband gives written permission or she breaks up with him before it happens." "Do you recognize me, asshole?" The man shook his head. "You know, you really should find out who you're having fun with, dumbass. Other pissed-off husbands might sneak up on you and kick your ass. I'm Marcy's husband." A light went on in Andrew's eyes. "She broke up with me. I'm not going to see her anymore." "I guess that was just today, wasn't it?" Andrew nodded. "I assume you entertained all last week while I was away too?" Andrew nodded again. "Listen up, asshole. The cops are coming soon. I want you to tell them. Just tell them it's Marcy's husband and then they'll find me. I want to go to jail because when I get out, I'll be even more pissed off at bastards like you." In the distance, Chuck heard a siren. He figured someone had finally called 911. He wasn't going to stay there when the cops arrived. They would have to work hard to find him. He also wanted the cops to go looking for Marcy. Then she could think about how precarious her physical well-being was. It was hard to do, but he managed to give Andrew a shot in the chest to make him realize what the future held for him. Chuck stood up and nonchalantly stepped aside a full minute before the first cruiser arrived on the scene. He walked back to his car on the next street over, sat there for a while, and then drove off. He drove to the other side of town and found a payphone. And that was probably the last time he would talk to anyone in his family. He had to know. The call was addressed to Becky. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Becky. I just want you to know that I went by the house and got some clothes. I'm not going back there again. Tell your mom to get her boyfriend to do some yard work. It's the least he can do." "Dad, she's not dating him. This whole thing was a big mistake. She never cheated on you." "Shut up and listen. I just talked to Mr. Cornings. He admitted to entertaining her at the house all last week. Now I know you knew about it. All I need is honesty. Did you know she was entertaining him before the anniversary party?" "Dad, no, he wasn't there. I know it looks bad, but he wasn't there at all. Just ask Mom, she'll tell you. It's all a mistake. She's been crying for a week." "Becky, you're my daughter, and I love you. And I always will, but I don't really like you right now. She's a slut, and you're a liar to her. I hope you can come to terms with your decision to protect her." "Dad, please. No, don't hang up the phone. Mom loves you." "Yes, just like she did when I was a senior in high school. She loved me enough to agree to another man's request to go to prom without parting with me. It was my graduation. She had 2 more graduations to go to, but she couldn't wait for me to go to college. She just had to have her cake and eat it too. The only thing is, she didn't think it through and lost her friends for a whole year by sleeping with me. Now she's proving she loves me again and is only having fun with some asshole. Not once has she talked to me about it. Not once have I gotten a hint of what she wants out of our relationship. I work, I build for her, I do everything I can to make her happy, but Andrew is the one who should have been sitting at the head table on our anniversary." Becky was now crying into the tube. "Please, Daddy, it's not that bad. Please understand Mom." Something stirred in Chuck's brain. Becky was still begging. "Please come home so Mom can explain everything. You can get through this and be happy again. You need to see it from her side before you make any rash decisions." The cries grew louder and louder. Something was trying to get through to his consciousness. He remained silent and let Becky speak, unable to stop crying. "You have to understand it from a woman's point of view. Mom can tell you what really happened, and she wants to. She was unfulfilled." The thought exploded in his brain like a grenade. You knew, didn't you? Ever since you came home from college, you've been spouting feminist bullshit about how women have been suppressed for so long and now they should be the oppressors. You told your mother to get a lover, didn't you? You bitch. How can you say you love me when you put a knife in my back? Becky began to cry even harder. There was no denial. I became your father. I carried you when you were too tired to walk. I carried you on my shoulders so you could see parades. I changed your diapers when you were very small. I attended every event, even when I was too busy or too tired to even think. I bought you a car, and I'm paying for your education. And this is how I pay for my love. You advise your stinking whore to have a lover. Don't talk to your father. Don't try to explain your needs. Just go and entertain someone behind my back. You weren't supposed to know. We didn't mean to hurt you. It wasn't supposed to happen. Yeah, of course it did. Everyone's going to find out. Luckily, we all found out before I became the laughingstock of the whole town. I had to beat up one of my employees today to get the whole team working again. Your feminist bullshit never considers the consequences of the shit you're talking about. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. Your mom and I are against the world, and you are on our side against the rest of us who are trying to break us up. But no, your shit doesn't stink, so you think I'm just going to walk away and let you play me for a fool. I wasn't worried at all about my self-respect, my masculinity. Becky tried to break through his diatribe. Please, Daddy, please listen. No, you stinking whore, no! Chuck hung up the phone. He couldn't go on. Tears of frustration, sorrow at the loss of his daughter, sadness for his lost family, and just plain tears of self-pity streamed down his face, which he was entitled to. People passing by looked at his face with concern, but didn't stop to see why he was so upset. The thoughts in his head were whirling so frantically that he might have just stepped out into the roadway if some guy hadn't grabbed him and turned him back to the curb. The Good Samaritan almost got a smack for his efforts, but his hey, 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 hey was enough to pierce the fog in Chuck's head. Chuck squeezed his savior's hands in gratitude. He nodded, since he couldn't speak yet, and then let him go. He sat down on the curb and let his grief pour out. After a few minutes, he regained control of himself and was able to look around. He fought the urge to hurry up and meet his new favorite color and never come back. He needed to forget himself, if only for a moment. And suddenly he would be able to emphasize that he was every drunk. Just forgetting for a few minutes would bring tremendous peace, but he knew from his experience of a week ago that it wouldn't work. God, had it really only been a week and a half since the anniversary party? It seemed like a lifetime since then, and every day was full of shit. A cop came by and inquired about Chuck's mental state. Chuck assured him he'd be fine. When the cop asked if he had been drinking, Chuck had to laugh. No, thank God, because it would have been 10 times worse. My marriage is dead, and my daughter helped destroy it. That's pretty much the whole story. I'm lonely, and I'll be lonely for a while yet. He stood up from the curb and wiped the dust off his ass. Chuck looked the cop straight in the eye. Yeah, I'll be okay, but it's going to take some time. He shook the cop's hand and headed for his car. He was surprised he hadn't been arrested for assaulting Andrew, but shrugged it off. They'd find him eventually. He wasn't going anywhere. He bought a bottle of bourbon on the way to the van, but he was going to mostly contemplate the amber color, slowly sipping his only drink of the night. The next morning he arrived at work early so he could get things done before finding a good divorce attorney. He asked his co-workers' opinions on attorneys and came up with a few options. Curiously, even the women didn't try to talk him into forgiving and moving home. The damage to his sanity must have been more obvious than he realized. He contacted the lawyers and made an appointment to check them out. The first lawyer turned out to be a bit flighty and full of ideas on how to divide the estate equally. Chuck wasn't impressed with that. Marcy deserved something, but not half of it, not after what she'd done. He went to the second lawyer and found a shark. It was a female lawyer who had been burned by her ex, another lawyer. After making a deal with the judge, he took almost everything from her. Chuck told her the whole story. When he got to the part where Marcy announced Andrew Cornings to the world, she slammed herself down on the table. "We have it now!" she exclaimed. "We'll get testimony from everyone who was present. The judge won't pay attention to how you were humiliated in front of people who mean the world to you." Similar exclamations erupted as Chuck recounted how he had to confront Butch to get the crew back to work. "More examples of your wife giving you a kick in the teeth." The final straw in the interview was when Chuck told Julie, his attorney, about how Becky had helped her mother. "What a stupid bitch. We women don't need to become equal by demeaning men. We become equal by proving we are equal, not better. That takes time and effort. Hell, until a few years ago, a woman had no chance of making partner in a law firm, and now we women are making partner faster than men." They outlined the division of property. In general, Chuck wanted the lion's share of the savings and investments. In return, Marcy would keep the house. After all, Chuck had built it for her, and it was her overall design. Chuck would continue to pay for Becky's education as she was accepted into medical school. Another advantage of being a woman. The previous ratio of men to women in school was becoming the opposite as educational institutions attracted women, especially minorities. Becky was not a minority, so she had to beat out several minorities, but she got in, ahead of several very qualified men. And there were other requirements that Julie felt would not prevent a divorce. One was that Chuck was not to attend any meeting that Marcy or Becky attended. Marcy was to be served at her workplace. Julie felt it was appropriate since her co-workers were attending the anniversary party. The message was clear. Have fun with Chuck, and everyone would know the consequences. The official wording was adultery, but the petition also included the words public humiliation and disrespect. At the same time, various of Marcy's co-workers were served subpoenas to testify about what they knew about the affair and when they found out about it. Family members were also subpoenaed, along with Billy and his wife. Julie informed Chuck that Marcy had cried in front of her boss and co-workers when she read the papers. Apparently, it had never occurred to her that Chuck might file for divorce. Since neither Becky nor her mother knew Chuck's new address or phone number, they tried to contact him through work. That didn't bring them any success. Billy gave his secretary strict instructions to reject calls from the two men. Marcy managed to get Chuck on the phone once when she lied and said she was a customer. The call was short. Chuck abruptly hung up. Julie reported that Marcy and Becky had shown up for their first meeting. They had few counterclaims, but Marcy broke down when she was handed the paperwork to change her last name from Newmeyer to Baines. Becky was also extremely upset when she was handed a copy of the paperwork to change her last name from Newmeyer to Baines. Chuck was afraid that he wouldn't be able to get Becky to change her last name, but he wanted her to realize the consequences of her actions. In his eyes, she was no longer his daughter. Over the next few weeks, Marcy hired an attorney who immediately filed a petition for marital counseling and also wanted a different division of property. He was actually trying to prove mental cruelty since Chuck had moved out without warning and wouldn't talk to his wife. Julie laughed at this revelation. If the case had gone to trial, Marcy's attorney could have been punished by the judge. And the first court hearing was the first time Chuck found himself in the same room with Marcy and Becky after the anniversary celebration, or abortion, if you want to put it into words. Several months had passed. Becky was supposed to be in class, but was excused to support her mother. The judge had questions for each defendant. He realized that Marcy was fighting for a divorce. Her attorney brought her to the stand to give her side of the story. She said she was so excited about the anniversary that she started drinking early in the day, which she had never done, and that she was drunk by noon. Judge, I am very sorry to say that I almost fell over from drinking. Why anyone stayed and put up with me I cannot understand. But all our friends and relatives stayed. I honestly don't remember what I said when I stood up to talk to everyone. I think I passed out right after I spoke. When asked about the affair, Marcy denied having an affair. She stated that any comments she might have made were just the result of alcohol. She loved Chuck and was utterly destroyed that he had thrown 25 years of marriage down the drain because of the ramblings of a drunken woman. It was Julie's turn to ask questions. She started with the alleged affair. Marcy denied it again and said that Chuck must be out of his mind if he believed she could be having an affair. Julie smiled at Marcy and asked if she understood the penalty for perjury. Marcy looked at her attorney and nodded. Julie gestured to her compatriot at the chamber door. The door opened, and Andrew Cornings was led inside and seated in the last row. Enough time had passed for all the lacerations on his face to heal, but his nose was no longer the cute, boyish nose it had been. It was still irregularly shaped and seemed to get in the way of breathing. Julie turned to look at Marcy again. Marcy had a haggard look on her face. "Mrs. Newmeyer, I'm going to ask you again about your alleged affair with personal trainer Andrew Cornings. Did you really have an affair that began before the anniversary party and the revelations you spewed out to those present, and didn't the affair continue after the party until your husband returned to town? If you do not answer truthfully, I will ask Mr. Cornings to come forward as a witness." Marcy lowered her head and nodded. Julie said for the court reporters, "Let the record show that Mrs. Newmeyer nodded her head in agreement with the question." The judge cut to the chase. "Mrs. Newmeyer, I would like to know why you had an affair and why you are trying to hide it from everyone when it became public? You somehow think you have the right to break your wedding vows with impunity, and your lawyer seems obligated to punish your husband who has done nothing but be a good husband and father." He stopped and looked at her over his glasses. "If I could, I'd put you in jail for attempted perjury and throw you out of the courtroom, but I can't." He looked at Marcy's attorney. "In pleading guilty to treason, do you wish to amend your counter-motion?" The lawyer nodded. Chuck guessed that Marcy had woven a web of excuses to make him believe her version of events. The judge cleared his throat and told Marcy to take a seat at the table next to Becky and the lawyer. Julie smiled at Chuck and whispered, "I think we just won. How much, I don't know yet. He'll probably still schedule a counseling session." The judge turned to Chuck with a specific question. "Sir, I realize your wife committed a grave misdemeanor, but worse things have happened in marriages, and they've survived. Do you see any path to forgiveness? I'm seriously considering scheduling counseling." Chuck stood up. "Your Honor, I've been trying to find a path to forgiveness too. But this isn't the first time my wife has pulled a stunt like this. The first time was when we were dating in high school. Since we grew up together and I'm a couple years older, I was always assigned as her protector and friend in elementary school. We started dating in junior high and continued dating through high school. A few weeks before graduation, Marcy announced that she was going with someone else. She wasn't going to break up with me and expected us to date on other occasions. She wanted it all, to date me, but to do what she liked with others, and expected me to go along with it." Chuck paused to catch his breath. "We didn't date for 2 years, since I was in college, and only came home for vacations. I refused to be in the same room with her, even though our families were great friends and neighbors. When I moved back after college, I thought she had grown up and we started dating again, and then got married." He paused and looked at Marcy and Rebecca. He could no longer call her Becky as she was a stranger to him. "Your Honor, I believe that my lack of trust that I am capable of handling criticism of my shortcomings, my lack of faith that I will try to change myself, and the lack of respect from my wife and my former daughter make it impossible for me to consider forgiveness now or in the near future. I can't even imagine being in the same room with them, except for the fact that I had to appear today to give my side of the story. As soon as your gavel is down, I'll be the first out the door, sir." The judge nodded. "I understand, sir. I've been sitting on this bench for many years. Both husbands and wives have appeared before me. Some have managed to rebuild their marriages, but most have been destroyed by the rash actions of their spouses. However, I am very saddened that this has happened for all of you." He paused and looked at the papers. "I see that you, Mr. Newmeyer, are requesting that your wife be given back her maiden name. She hasn't signed the papers, and I can't give the order. I also notice that you are asking your daughter to legally change her last name to Baines, which was your wife's maiden name. Since you have explained yourself, I now understand why you made this request. Again, I can't force someone to legally change their last name. Sometimes I wish I could. I would advise you, and I'm sure your attorney has also advised you, to change your will and make sure that all life insurance policies have different beneficiaries. Since you can't change their names, you can make sure they don't benefit from your death. He shuffled the papers again. I see no reason to drag this case out. Against your wishes, Mrs. Newmeyer, I am granting your husband's request for a divorce. Unless he petitions otherwise 120 days from today, the divorce will be final. I grant his request for division of property. I am confident that the value of the house has far exceeded the original cost of construction, so you will be able to sell it for a profit at any time. I see no reason why you would benefit from your error in judgment despite your attorney. I would advise you to choose your next relationship wisely, or you will find yourself back in court. He looked at Rebecca. I haven't heard from you at all today, but I wish you would realize what you started when you encouraged your mother to break her wedding vows. The fact that you both disrespected Mr. Newmeyer and made no attempt to communicate your wants and needs is disturbing. I can't legislate from the bench, so the only ones affected are you. You will have to live with your decisions, so I would advise you both to once again step back from such a decision, take a deep breath, and consider the results of your actions. Perhaps you will do better next time. His gavel came down, and Chuck was soon a free man. He ran out of the hall. He wasn't going to talk to any of them again. Besides, he was scheduled for additional training with his favorite teachers. This was his fourth such appointment with a teacher. He had no idea what the topic would be this time, but every other topic had been educational and eye-opening for him. Some of the targets were too far out of his taste, but he made an effort to understand them. Marcy dated and even remarried. That failed after a couple years, as the new husband no longer stood up to comparison with the first. Chuck had somehow become a saint and could do no wrong. She started stalking Chuck, although the term hadn't come into fashion yet. She followed him around and tried to intercept him in random situations. After all, it had worked before, hadn't it? She'd even threatened a couple of Chuck's girlfriends, but with little success. While the girlfriend might have decided to leave, Chuck wasn't going to see Marcy again. He loved her and had a crush on her, but he didn't like her anymore, and that was an obstacle she couldn't overcome. Rebecca used her father's money to complete her education. She then set aside about the same amount and tried to pay it back to him. He was firm in his desire to no longer recognize her. She eventually put the money into a fund to help spouses with counseling and became a very active supporter of counseling. Chuck's wish and prayer came true for Rebecca. She dated another doctor while in medical school, and they were soon married. She thought their marriage was as good as her parents had before their wedding anniversary. Apparently it was. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video. As I walked past the conference room, my life went from shit to a damn borax, Scottish for truly a huge damn mess. I saw Bill showing pictures on the big screen from the wedding he attended yesterday. What caught my attention was what was in the background. My nemesis Darren Bryant was hugging my wife Judith as they headed to the hotel on the trail. Bill knew Judith, so he knew what was going on. No one said anything to me about it. Friends and co-workers. I realized from the laughter of the group that they had all seen it and already knew. Not only that, it was old news. I didn't stop. If they did see me, they didn't give me any sign. I dismissed the idea of them seeing me and laughing at me. I found out later that it was the damn truth. Donald Harvey, our manager, had me covering Bryant all the time. That day I had to cover him again. Harvey canceled my vacation because Bryant had an emergency class. Judith left on her own. Or did I think she did now? I spent the rest of the day not doing any work but plotting revenge against my cheating wife, that bastard, and my so-called co-workers. I didn't want to work here a minute longer than I had to. I went to HR and asked about my notice period and annual leave. I knew I was due at least 7 weeks. It turned out that Harvey hadn't canceled my vacation. I showed Stella his letter canceling his vacation and explaining the reason. She just looked at me sadly. Even she freaking knew. I was absolutely furious. I discussed everything with her and her roommate, the financial controller. I am highly organized. It makes my job so much easier. Maybe it is right that I suffer from OCD. I keep records of all my work and expenses. I was able to prove that Harvey was falsifying records to stop payments to me, which were then transferred to Bryant. Eventually, they were able to confirm that I was due 9 weeks of 3 days annual leave. I was owed over £17,000, which was paid to Bryant. Stella had printed everything out. I copied them down as I didn't trust anyone else. My termination period was 12 weeks as I had specialized skills. I went back to my desk and wrote my resignation letter. I didn't give it to Harvey, whom I just stared at until he was completely embarrassed. I had always been obedient. The only time I complained was when I had to fill in for Bryant. I went to meet with the CEO, David Bennett, one of the members of the family that owned the company. His secretary told me he was busy. I told her I needed to see him urgently. Otherwise, I would contact a lawyer. She was very surprised at my tone. It was a very different me. She spoke to him again. He told her that he would be free in 20 minutes and for me to come in then. I knew from his tone that something was wrong. Later, when I thought about it, he tried not to laugh. I went back in and he kept me waiting. 10 minutes later, he let me in. There was no handshake. Sorry for the wait. Well, Adam, what's got you so riled up? He smirked. I was actually calm, which surprised me. Here's my resignation letter. I've been shit on enough already. I've had my vacation canceled supposedly in the best interest of the firm. Everyone laughs behind my back when Darren Bryant entertains my wife, and I have to cover his work while he does it. Harvey forges payroll so Bryant gets paid for my work, so you owe me over £17,000. You'll see those invoices there. Given my annual leave, despite Harvey trying to give it to Bryant, I have just over 2 weeks to work. I'll work them off, but I'm not going to cover Bryant. He could get in trouble. He could get in a very serious accident. Bennett was not only silent, he was gloating. I could tell by the look on his face that he was thrilled with how I felt. You didn't know Bryant was entertaining your wife, did you? Dude, you're damn blind. He brags about it every damn time. I'll handle your money, now get out of here. Well, I knew where I stood. I'd have 2 weeks to get back at all these cunts, especially Bryant. I walked out of that office and his secretary almost shit herself. If I was angry before, it was obvious from the look on my face that I was looking for trouble. I walked back to my desk. I could see the others watching me, but no one approached me. They had never seen me angry before. I finished my work on time. Harvey made me use my personal phone for work to save the firm money, since my phone could have 2 SIM cards. I took one out and left it on my desk. I didn't give them a second more than they needed. As I left, I saw some people looking at me like I was a stranger. Bill inquired, "For once you're leaving on time, Adam. What's wrong?" "I have an appointment," I replied gruffly, and continued walking. It was late evening on Thursday. Even the banks were open. I walked into the bank, met with the assistant, and opened new accounts in my name only. When she showed me the balance in the joint account that Judith and I maintained, it was very low. I saw missed payments. I asked why it was not being funded from her account as mandated. Judith canceled her mandate 10 months ago. The girl apologized as she should not have told me about it. I told her it was okay and I would not denounce her. The anger I felt was growing. I walked out of the bank and headed home. I needed to think and make a plan. I need to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Adam Holliday, 29 years old, nice looking. I keep myself fit by going to the gym 3 or so nights a week and doing a bit of running. I am a mechanical engineer with high electrical and computer skills, troubleshooting large machines. I work with very expensive computerized machines that many local repairmen don't have the specialized skills for. As a result, I have to travel a lot. I guess I am one of those people who is never seen, who is always in the background. I never stick out, I just do the job damn well. I am, as you've read, taken for a fool. But I'm not. I'm just conscientious and made the damn mistake of trusting the whore and my coworkers at work. I wanted our company to do well. I'll help anyone except Darren Bryant, who I've hated since our childhood paths crossed. I can't call him an asshole since assholes are useful. Judith had long ago treated me like something nasty that she stomped on. Now I knew why. I tried to talk to her, but she always managed to avoid talking to me. She was used to getting her way. At first, I let her do it because I loved her and wanted to see her happy, but lately just to avoid her sharp tongue. I realize it sounds like I'm a spineless weakling, but I always wanted her to have what she wanted. I thought that's what love was all about, making the other person happy. Apparently, in her world, that's not the case. Once home, I headed to my office. I often worked from home as there was less interference. We didn't have children, thankfully, so I had remodeled one room. Tonight, I was going to work on the most important plan of my life. If Judith had had a brief affair with someone else, I might be able to let her convince me to see a psychologist to try to repair the damage done and rebuild our marriage, even though it was unlikely. I tried to talk her into discussing our marital problems, but she was always too busy. However, she knew I hated Bryant with every breath I took, so this was beyond repair. It was a deliberate act designed to hurt me like hell. The fact that it was him hurt more than the fact that she was having fun with someone else, and that was painful enough. After the revelation at the bank, I checked all the bank statements for 2 years. I copied the relevant transactions into an Excel file. I reviewed the credit card bill and did the same. I checked the payments to this hotel against my work schedule and found that there were 6 to 10 per month, no less. Many of them came on days when I was filling in for Bryant at other facilities. I'm sure they laughed that I was paying them for their entertainment. I hoped he paid at least sometimes, but knowing him, I doubted it. So today I was going to one of his jobs when I got a call canceling my order because they had to self-isolate due to the COVID outbreak at the factory. Without that, I wouldn't have gotten into the office to see that picture. I had also covered Bryant the previous day. There were quite a few deals when Judith was on vacation that Harvey made me cancel. One of them involved a photographer. Given the time difference, I thought he might be at work. I called and told the receptionist who I was. I apologized, but we had a fire and lost the pictures he took. Can they stay in his archives? The receptionist checked the records and they are still there. If she printed them out and sent them to me, it would be expensive. But if she emailed them, I could print them myself or have the firm do it. I thanked her and asked her to email them to me. It would be easier for both of us since international shipping can be difficult. I opened the file to all the information I had gathered. The pictures confirmed my suspicions. Bryant's course was to entertain my wife at my expense. One of Judith's perks is having the latest car. She leases them. Last year, she forgot her driver's license and bank cards, so everything was put in my name. Not surprisingly, she hasn't made a single payment on the car. The lease expires in 2 months. I thought that was great. For the next 2 months, I'll have use of my car, but I won't renew the lease. I needed access to her account. When we got married, she wanted her own account so she wouldn't have to explain to me how she spends her money. She works for an advertising agency. So we agreed to keep our own account and pay into a joint account for household needs, council tax, food, utilities, vacations, etc. I changed all passwords for computer, phone, and safe access. I checked that the prenuptial agreement that Judith's father had insisted on was in place. I copied it and saved it in a new folder. I gave it a technical name, which Judith would assume was a working name if she managed to find out my login details. The file itself was given another access password. I put all the documents I would need, including this file, into cloud storage, using a VPN to cover my tracks, so I had access to a copy of everything whenever I needed it. I use a key generator, so no Mom 1 or Mom 2 for me. I counted up all the money Judith owed me. It came out to just over £47,000. She, or rather I, had been paying for this hotel room for 14 months. The vacation alone cost £11,000. We had a joint savings account with £105,000 in it. They were to go towards extending this house. My idea, because it has big rooms and a large plot. Plenty of room for our kids to play when she feels she can have them. We talked about kids before we were married, but she changed her mind soon after and became more career-oriented. If I didn't like it, well, fine. Why did I put up with her crap for so long, I asked myself. She wanted to buy a rabbit hole in a posh neighborhood. I refused, which annoyed the hell out of her. It was probably one of the few times I stubbed my toe. So the house fund went unused. She didn't replenish it for a year either. I added £6,000. Now looking at her wishes, you can tell that if we moved, her name would be put on the property. My house would pay for most of the costs. She could claim a share in this new house when we divorced. A lucky escape. I transferred £105,000 into my new account. If she complained, I would say that her share would cover her debt to me. When I completed all the necessary money movements, I canceled the debit and credit cards of the joint account. I realize now that I should have paid attention to the accounts, but Judith did it all. Why the hell did I trust her, especially considering the way she treats me? When I finished, Judith wasn't home yet, so I put the pizza in the oven. If no one called Bryant, she wouldn't know I was in the loop. If she didn't come home, then they knew. I was just finishing my pizza when she arrived. To say she was shocked would be putting it mildly. She gasped, "I thought you were at the office." I smiled. "I had an appointment, and I left my phone there. No big deal." She relaxed. "I've already eaten. I'm going to take a shower," and almost jogged towards our room. I guessed why. I waited until I heard the sound of the shower. As she entered the room, she dropped her purse on the table as usual. I opened it and pulled out my wallet and cell phone. I logged into the computer under her account. I used her bank card to work with the card reader to access her accounts. She had the ones I knew about as well as 2 accounts that each held over £100,000. I copied all these accounts into my file. I downloaded the contents of her email. I opened her phone. She used the same PIN code on all her devices and sent copies of messages and calls to my file in the same way. I replaced everything in her purse and was sitting down with a cup of tea when she came downstairs. She was dressed rather drab compared to her work clothes. I decided to give her a pep talk. I'm not worth a little fancy dressing up for. She only looked at me in her usual dismissive manner. "I'm too tired. Maybe one more night." I laughed. "Yeah, why not? It's only been 12 months since you gave me access to your body. I think it's time for us to get a divorce, or I can get your marriage annulled since you're still a virgin." She stared at me, trying to figure out what was behind my words. She wasn't happy, and I didn't care. I continued. "Bill was showing pictures from the wedding yesterday in the office when I came in." She looked at me. "I didn't think you'd be interested." "I didn't think I would. Is this Marion's 3rd wedding? Maybe this time she'll keep her legs shut for someone other than the cool guy who married her." She gave me a hard look. "What a nasty thing to say. I've never heard you talk about someone like that before." I added, "I heard she was up to some mischief at her bachelorette party. You went and blabbed." She got angry. "You don't need to listen to gossip. Everything went off without incident." I let loose another arrow. "That's not what the gossip at the water cooler said. I hope she and the rest of the contestants were tested for STDs." Judith left for the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I've hit a nerve, I thought. I went back to my office and researched the divorce laws. The good news was that I owned the house before we were married, so she had no rights to it. Usually property is divided 50-50 if there are no children. This was good since her 2 major accounts were in my favor. Alimony could be awarded if one spouse earned more than the other. The prenuptial agreement spelled out changes to the standard agreement based on adultery. No alimony was awarded for the innocent party. No claim to other property, such as an automobile. All expenses were placed on the adulterer. I was glad her father insisted on this. I knew I needed more evidence as Judith, Bennett, and Bryant would deny everything. In the morning, I called my old friend Danny, a local plumber. He used to work at this hotel a lot. When we met at the pub, his stories about the things he retrieved from the toilets amused everyone. I went to sleep in the guest room. I wasn't going to give the ice maiden any chance to melt. The next morning, I went to work, and my own work at that. I guessed from Judith's, "I thought you were at the office" comment that my phone was tapped. I checked my SIM card, but found no tracker on it. When I inserted a working SIM card, I found it hidden as described on the internet. I bought a phone for £20 and put the company's SIM card in it. I left this phone at work. On the way to work, I called Danny. I explained what Judith and Bryant were up to. Danny hates Bryant too. Bryant was the school bully until I beat the crap out of him. Next time he'd be reassigned to the other gender. Danny was going to the hotel that day, so he'd have news for me later. He had an idea for evidence. I was back in the office by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Work was going smoothly for a change. I went to the finance department and gave them my new account details. I left strict instructions not to share these details with anyone. My tone surprised the girls. I left at 5 in the evening. Danny called and suggested we have a pint of beer later, and I agreed to meet at 8 in our neighborhood. Judith wasn't home, so I made myself some dinner and settled down in front of the TV. She arrived around 7:30 and was surprised to see me again. I told her, "I'm off. I have a hot date with a nymphomaniac. Maybe I'll see you Monday." She just looked at me. She smiled. "So she's in for a disappointment then?" I laughed. "Maybe she'll be interested in me and not just herself." I walked away before I wet myself. She was angry. Bullseye. I was really starting to realize that my life was about to change for the better. Danny brought pints and we sat down in the corner, away from the others. "Adam, you don't deserve this. You're a stand-up guy. You'll help anyone. No one at your job bothered to tell you that. Screw them. A lot of people hate Bryant. You remember Kate Duncan? He used to pull her hair and call her names at school. She works in a hotel. She's single, very pretty, with the body you dream of. She would never have fun with a married man like me. I told her about them and about you. She's still partial to you for some reason." "Oh, yeah. You caught Bryant pulling her off the bench by the hair and beat the crap out of him. I'd never seen you angry before, but that day you looked like nothing was going to stop you. If he tried to hide behind a brick wall, you would have gone through it to get him. No one tried to stop you. They're booked in for next week, Wednesday and Thursday. She'll make sure they get a separate room. There will be a video camera hidden in it to capture them. After they're done, I'll make an emergency call to deal with the clogged toilet in the room. I'll pick up the camera and give you the SD card. It's so small it will fit in the smoke alarm that's on the bed." I told him, "I owe you both." He smiled. "No, that's what he deserves. I thought Judith had more intelligence." We had a couple more beers each, and I headed home. In the morning, she suggested we go to the car dealership and look for a new car since the lease was coming to an end. "You don't mean my new car? It's registered in my name and you haven't paid a dime for it. We can go and I'll tell them I'll return it when the lease expires." She looked completely dumbfounded. She left without waiting for me. She came back 15 minutes later. "My debit and credit cards don't work. What have you done?" she shouted. I calmly replied, "I was checking the account because I was sure I had paid the bill, but I got a letter asking me to pay it. I saw that you haven't paid anything on your house account in a year. I'm not going to support your lifestyle of treating me like crap. I canceled the cards. Use your own goddamn ones." She got even more pissed off. I very rarely swore at her. "It must be the bank's mistake," she almost shouted. "No, they showed me your order rescinding the mandate. No goddamn mistake." "How?" she screamed. I called them to find out the reason because I thought it was a mistake. Turns out the mistake was me trusting you with our finances. I felt like she was about to explode. The rest of the weekend we didn't talk. I mowed the grass and tidied up the garden. I painted the decking in front of our bedroom as the smell of decking paint made her sick. Monday at work, I tackled the paperwork. I also drafted emails to all my clients explaining why I would no longer be working at Bennett's after I was officially laid off. I will be looking for a job after that date. Several people tried to poach me, but because of my sense of loyalty, okay, I'll add stupidity, I didn't pursue the change. I sent them just before I left. Access to them was password protected, so no one would find out. I changed all my work codes. Harvey wasn't in the office. I felt cheated. I expected him to pounce on me with accusations that he had fired me and that he had cheated me out of my money. I looked for any opportunity to plop him on the table and rearrange his body parts. I went to see a lawyer. I've known Dawn since high school. I explained the circumstances. I needed a new will. If anything happened to me, I didn't want anything to go to Judith. Dawn quickly drafted a will detailing the reasons I was changing it so that any time I tried to revoke it in court, they would have a reason in front of them. The house I was going to leave to my nephew and niece, my sister's children. This would really annoy Judith as my sister hates her to the core. They have a small house, so this would allow them to move into it, but the title would remain with the children. I don't like her husband. Judith was legally entitled to a percentage of the cash before the divorce, but Dawn showed me how to reduce the amount classified as cash. When we were done with the details, she had her secretary type it all up. If I came in later in the afternoon, I could sign it, and it would be witnessed and notarized. I did so, and the document was duly signed. Dawn started talking about the divorce. I told her everything I thought, and she said she would help me at friendly rates. She hated Bryant, too. I don't think anyone at school had a kind word to say about him. I admit I would have gone to his funeral, but only to help load him into the crematorium furnace. If he had been buried, I would have danced on his grave and peed on it. I talked about everything that had happened at Bennett's, the holiday, and the hotel. I was hoping to have the videotape this week, and when I did, I was going to kick that whore out. I told her about the contents of Judith's cell phone. The messages between her and Bryant talked about the fun they were planning and how I was a cuckold and a loser. Judith was as bad as he was at humiliating me. The emails revealed that Harvey, Bennett, and Bryant made up the story so Bryant could go on vacation with Judith at my goddamn expense. They all had a damn good laugh about it. Dawn told me to email everything to her. She'll get the divorce papers ready. She'll also prepare the papers to sue Bennett and company for various unlawful employment practices. She'll know who to hand them to Judith, either at our house or at her place of employment. I laughed. Dawn looked at me. If their date on Wednesday is videotaped, can we file it when they leave the room on Thursday? Dawn laughed. I didn't realize you had such a vindictive streak in you. That's great. Danny and Kate set up the camera. It picked them up. Kate downloaded the content for Danny, who emailed it to me. Kate put the camera in place on the second attempt. Dawn filed the papers with the court on Thursday morning and received the court document later that morning. She asked for it as a favor. Bryant didn't seem to be liked anywhere. As they were leaving the hotel room in the afternoon, a sheriff's officer handed Judith the papers. She screamed and cried. Who cares? Not me. At Dawn's direction, he removed the house and car keys from her keychain. I left work early that day. I packed all her clothes in black garbage bags and left them by the front door for her to pick up. I kept her wedding ring, since it was a family heirloom, and the damn expensive diamond earrings, bracelet, and necklace that she just had to take with her on her honeymoon. I included all of her paperwork. My home phone rang and her parents' number popped up on the screen. I answered it. Her father yelled into the phone, "What the hell you got?" As I hung up, he called again and started the same thing. I hung up again. 6 times we did this dance until her sister Janine called. She at least tried to speak. Adam, can you tell us what happened? Judith is confused. We can't understand what she's saying. She said something about a divorce. What happened? I took a slow breath. Janine, Judith has been treating me like crap for at least a year. Nothing I did was right. It turns out that for the last 14 or 15 months, she's been having an affair with Darren Dam Bryant. I just found out about it. There's a lot more, but we're done. You can come and get her things. The door locks have already been changed. I will enforce the prenup your father wanted to put in place to protect his whore. When I said that, you could hear him yelling at me. I hung up the phone. An hour later, Janine arrived on her own. She brought their big car. I helped her put all the stuff in it. She asked questions, and I explained to her. She shook her head. She was always a stupid, selfish cow. She had a great boyfriend, and she left him for a lowlife like Bryant. He's not fit to tie your shoelaces. I feel so sorry for you. After they left the hotel, Danny took the video camera, so we had 2 days of evidence. He gave me the video camera at Dawn's request. I picked up the car from the hotel parking lot and went to bed. Tomorrow at work would be interesting. Before entering the main office, I went to the kitchen and put some chocolates in a box. Lots of pretty chocolates. This office has a lot of sweet tooth. Too bad I changed the contents. They were laxative chocolates, very explosive. I poured a powder containing pepper on the toilet seats. I turned on the toilet paper and paper towel dispensers. I walked into the office and it was obvious that everyone was aware of what had happened the day before. They seemed shocked that I could have done something like that. They talked about it, but not about Bryant entertaining my wife with me. I opened my email and sent emails to my clients, then deleted the entry. I expected today to be my last day. I used a program to clear the computer's free space of anything that could still be recovered. Bennett walked out of his office with Harvey and Bryant. Everyone was furious. Bennett shouted, "Why couldn't you leave it alone, you cuckold? You're a goddamn loser. Why get a divorce? Nobody wants a loser like you." Bryant smirked. "Why did you call your divorce adultery? You're just admitting to the world that you're a cuckold. She needed a real man." I laughed. That pissed him off even more. He continued, "You could have just said irreconcilable differences. It doesn't change anything." I spoke calmly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. That cunt's name is here for a reason. Every place he works will be watching him. Every woman he looks at will know he will be entertaining them. That means the divorce will be in a few weeks, not a year. I'm not a damn loser. I put my trust in some idiots and got screwed. Rest assured, I'll get mine back. There's always tomorrow. You're just bastards." Bennett shouted, "You can get out. Don't expect any references or the money you say you're owed." I held out the letter from Dawn to him. I had a little video camera on me that filmed them, so I had proof that he'd gotten it. I spoke to them slowly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. This is a complaint of workplace bullying related to Bryant's solicitation of prostitution. I have all of your emails, messages, in which you arranged for him to take my place at that party. I turned to the audience. Everything you knew, and no one had the decency to tell me about it. Don't you ever bloody try to talk to me again. You are the lowest scum on earth. This place is a cesspool. How many others like you are covered by the wives or husbands of other so-called friends and co-workers? I could see that some of those words hit the mark. I'd hate to get a reference from here. When this comes up in court, who's going to use Bennett? I looked Bryant in the eye and smiled my best evil grin. Until we meet again, you little jerk. He crapped his pants. I stepped back. The fury on Bennett's face was absolutely adorable. I almost expected to hear him collapse to the floor with a severe stroke, not fatal, but hopefully enough to ruin the rest of his miserable goddamn life. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I headed home. There were several calls on the answering machine. Janine was asking if I was okay and if Judith wanted to see me. One from her mom, "Judith is so upset, can we make up?" I called Janine. "I don't want to talk to that slut. We will never be together. She can have fun with Bryant and whoever she wants, I'm free of her." Janine understood. I decided to take a vacation and drove across the country in my car. It was actually not a bad car, comfortable and roomy. After 3 weeks, I returned to my house. A neighbor saw me pulling up and turned to me. Adam, some people tried to take over your house. I called the police. They took them away. The cops left their details for you to contact them. I thanked him. I called the police and spoke to one of the officers. It was Judith's father and brother. They had come because Judith wanted to take the engagement ring and diamond set that she claimed belonged to her. They did not try to break down the door, so they were advised to contact a real estate attorney. I thanked the officer. I was happy the bitch was off the hook. 6 weeks later, I was in court for a divorce hearing. Sitting in the press box was Dawn's sister Avril, a reporter for the local newspaper. This was going to be fun. Judith's attorney began by stating that his client did not want a divorce, that she had only lost her way a couple of times, and was very sorry for the pain she had caused. She would like the court to order counseling so we can forget about her recklessness. If the court feels it cannot do this, her husband will take £105,000 out of their joint account. She was due half that amount. Dawn stood up. Perhaps Mrs. Holliday could appear in court, and we could check her actions. Her lawyer quickly tried to prevent this. The sheriff noted his reluctance to have her as a witness. Dawn continued. My lord, this marriage is over. Mrs. Holliday had an affair with Darren Bryant, aided and abetted by Mr. Holliday's manager and owner of the firm. Bryant also works there. Mr. Holliday was fired from their job for having the audacity to divorce this adulteress rather than allow them to continue their games with him. This affair went on for about 15 months before her husband found out. It was a deliberate act on her part as she knew Bryant and her husband hated each other. It stretches back to their childhood days when Bryant was the school bully until Mr. Holliday dealt with him. With the connivance of his superiors, Mr. Holliday was forced to cancel a vacation trip intended to try to improve their relationship. Bryant went instead. My client was forced to work to fill in for Bryant, who was on an important course. Completely bogus. That was a year ago. The fact that she took Bryant on leave rather than her husband shows Mrs. Holliday's utter contempt for her husband. Since then, my client has had no intimate relations with his wife, for which he is now very grateful. Her attorney raises the issue of the division of marital property. At her request, both maintained personal accounts, but had a joint account for household expenses. Bank mandates paid so much monthly from each personal account until Mrs. Holliday took the liberty of canceling hers 10 months before their separation. This did not prevent Mrs. Holliday from spending money on her adultery, but she used only the joint account, which by this time held only Mr. Holliday's funds. In total, she spent more than £47,000 on Bryant and herself, funded by Mr. Holliday. Their emails and messages about it say gloatingly, the invoices for their hotel room and the bill used are contained in documents, which I will shortly provide to the court. This was not once or twice, as she wants us to believe, but over a period of 15 months, meeting at least 6 to 10 times a month, if not more. Mr. Holliday's neighbors claim that a man remarkably similar to Bryant was often at their home when Mr. Holliday was away for a few days because of his work. 1 or 2 occasions may be remedied by labor and goodwill on both sides, but such a perfunctory breach of the sanctity of marriage means there is no hope of reconciliation. The £105,000 bill was for house extensions or moving house. Mrs. Holliday has not contributed a penny to it in the last year, while Mr. Holliday has continued to pay £6,000. Mrs. Holliday did not pay the rental value of the car she drove. She specifically put it in Mr. Holliday's name so that he would pay for it. Her texts and emails show that this is exactly what she did. Any money Mrs. Holliday feels she is entitled to is more than offset by the amount she owes Mr. Holliday for the theft from the joint account. Judith's attorney stood up and stated that it was not theft. Dawn said it was a matter of interpretation. Judith, her father, and the lawyer were not amused. I only smiled complacently. Dawn continued. Prior to the marriage, both parties entered into a prenuptial agreement. Judith's solicitor interrupted her. We challenge the relevance of that document. In our opinion, this document misapplies the law. Dawn continued. It was drafted by a learned friend of mine, looking at solicitor Judith. It allows for the division of marital property, but does not allow for alimony to be paid to the injured partner. Mr. Holliday owned the house before the marriage. There was no mortgage because it was bequeathed to him after his parents died in a car accident. Mr. Holliday's accounts at the time of the separation are reflected in this document. Excluding the £105,000 already mentioned, his assets amounted to £34,900. Automobiles are excluded from all assets. Our investigation into Mrs. Halliday's financial situation revealed that she was aware of assets worth £53,400 after the marriage. Mr. Halliday was aware of these accounts. We discovered that she had 2 other accounts. Judith's sigh made everyone look at her. She looked at me, but I only held back a complacent smile. She looked really pissed off. Dawn continued. At the time of the separation, Mrs. Holliday had £217,674 in the 2 accounts. I have made a record of this in the documents I will present to the court. I ask that the assets be divided in the normal way. Mr. Holliday, although unfairly dismissed for standing up for himself, is not claiming any alimony. According to the prenuptial agreement, the adulterer pays all expenses, so I will send my account to my learned friend later today for settlement in the usual way within 7 days. Judith's lawyer stood up. My lord, I dispute the amount Mr. Holliday is demanding. The 2 accounts in question are her pension savings which had to be withdrawn due to financial changes, so they should be ignored. They should have been reinvested, but due to her emotional state in relation to the divorce, this did not happen. My client disputes Mr. Halliday's claim that she owed him over £47,000 in respect of the household account. As I have asked previously, I am seeking advice. Dawn replied, The payments on this account match the bonuses she received in her job. Again, the relevant documents refute the claim that these are her retirement savings. The sheriff retired for lunch, but not before asking Judith's attorney to speak with his client to confirm the truth or untruthfulness of the statements made in court this morning. He didn't like being lied to, so he hoped for the truth. After lunch, Judith's attorney stated that the facts reported by Dawn were true. The sheriff granted the divorce and ordered her to pay me £118,000. He disregarded £105,000, as these sums amounted to what she had spent specifically to humiliate her husband. In summing up, he expressed his displeasure at her behavior in relation to adultery and the fact that she had concealed her assets. Avril's article in the newspaper was excellent. It covered all the salient points except for the amount awarded. Judith, Bryant, Harvey, and Bennett were named and shamed. I was happy to be rid of this whore, but I wanted more, much more. Judith and her family had always been staunch churchgoers. My non-attendance didn't suit them. 2 weeks later was Mothering Sunday. I can only imagine their shock when they came out and saw numerous, at least 60 pictures of their daughter with Bryant and another 20 pictures of the minister with the wife of a local politician. Danny had set up the camera a day early, as the room was not booked that day. It wasn't until we were reviewing the footage that we noticed the priest. From the looks of it, all the parishioners were on edge. The priest had to run away from his wife's brothers. Judith's father almost had a stroke. What's in the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Maybe that's the one they should have paid attention to. 5 weeks after that, I was back in court against Bennett, Harvey, and Bryant. Avril was in the reporter's box again. Bennett's lawyer tried to get her removed, but the sheriff decided the case was in the public interest. Dawn called me to testify. I sat in the box for over an hour before she finished talking to me. I detailed the instances when Harvey had ordered me to fill in for Bryant at work, about the canceled vacation and the lack of payouts. When I checked the dates of withdrawals from our joint account, they matched. When I told Bennett about it, he only laughed. He knew about the affair since Bryant had openly bragged about it. I detailed how I had discovered texts, emails between the 4 of them, revealing their collusion. At the end, I reported that I was not paid for the period of my termination, as well as the amount paid to Bryant in my stead. Dawn's last two questions were, how would you describe the relationship between Bennett, Harvey, Bryant, and the other employees, especially over the last 15 months? I answered, I was treated with disdain. Harvey threatened me if I complained about covering for Bryant or having to fix his shoddy repairs. Bennett would just look at me and smirk. My so-called coworkers seemed to know jokes I didn't. They used my integrity to play tricks on me as I did my best for the company. Harvey even made me use my own cell phone to save the company money. He put a tracker on the company's SIM card so Bryant would know if I was coming. She asked, if you had known before, would you have worked as hard for them? I replied, no, I would have quit. I had offers, but I decided loyalty was a good trait to have. Dawn filed all the paperwork with the court. Copies of emails, texts, my business records and statements, payments made and due. Bennett's attorney tried to argue that I made up all the facts about non-payments, bullying, and more. I keep exemplary records, and he was unsuccessful. His attorney began his defense by stating that his client was not served with the documents that Friday, which the court had already heard. They weren't served on him until much later, so he didn't have time to study all the charges against him. I figured he was trying to make up for the fact that he hadn't been able to get anything from me. Dawn stood up and turned on the tape of me handing Bennett the papers, complete with time and date. The lawyer was angry at Bennett for misleading him. He asked for a continuance so he could talk to him. The sheriff gave him 20 minutes. Upon his return, the attorney called Bennett to testify. He accused me of not being paid due to an oversight because of customer termination problems. He notified the finance department to get me paid immediately. His attorney did not inquire about his knowledge of the affair or his involvement in it. Bennett was about to leave the witness stand when Dawn stood up. "One moment, Mr. Bennett," she smiled. Beware of her smile. I'm about to fry you. "Mr. Bennett, do you actively recruit people for extramarital affairs during your working hours?" Both Bennett and his lawyer looked at her. Bennett stammered, "No. Occasionally these things happen, but I don't hire people based on that." Dawn lowered her gaze to the paper in front of her. "Mr. Harvey, fired from previous employment for false reporting and adultery with secretary. Mr. Bryant, fired from his previous position. Mr. Carter, previously fired due to adultery with 3 women at his workplace. Mrs. Simmons, fired due to adultery at her previous place of employment with the husband of the owner's daughter. She spends 2 days a week in your office, doesn't she? Harvey, Bryant, Carter, and you share her sometimes. You talk about the wives of other employees you've entertained. You share your sexist jokes about horny husbands like Mr. Holliday who were decent men and foolishly confided in you." Bennett's supportive wife came out. "Tell me why you think hiring people is not pimping, not soliciting prostitution. After all, that's exactly what you're doing." Bennett blushed and couldn't answer. Bennett's attorney tried to prevent him from answering, but the sheriff decided that the question was legitimate because there was a complaint against him. Bennett was unable to answer. "The emails you sent to Mrs. Holliday about how to supervise her husband, were they the actions of a caring employer? Did they comply with health and safety regulations relating to the care of the physical and mental health of your employees? When you found out about his wife's affair with your work partner, you did nothing to inform him. Is this the act of a caring employer or a predator who is so keen to hurt someone because they are so much better than you? The only thing that made sense was not wanting him to leave because you needed his skills, but even then, you bullied him with Harvey's help. Sent him away so Bryant could entertain his wife. A caring employer. When he found out about it, instead of helping him, you ridiculed him and then unfairly fired him. Without him, we see what your company has become. All of these actions constitute bullying and harassment in the workplace. That's what you are, a bully and a predator." Dawn continued. "Who came up with the idea that Bryant should entertain Mrs. Holliday in order to screw Mr. Holliday?" Bennett lowered his eyes. The sheriff told him to answer. "Bryant. He hated Holliday. He knew the man was a better engineer, but that wasn't all." Why did you agree to this? I thought Holiday was a loser. He could be lost in a crowd. It was fun to watch that deluded bastard know nothing. It was no longer interesting to listen to Bryant talk about Judith and what bad she was. We planned for him to find out. We thought he'd capitulate. We could have wiped his nose for months, cuckold. But he fought back. He cheated us out of everything we had. All the clients who used him left us. Bryant is so afraid to go outside. Harvey shits himself if his name is mentioned. I looked up when he said they developed it. No wonder Bill kept quiet. He was in on it. They saw me and laughed at me after all. Screw them. Dawn continued. Whose idea was it to ask Mr. Holiday to pay for all the room orders? Harvey. He disliked Mr. Holiday as he always showed him up as a bad manager. A Holiday? Bryant and Harvey. I laughed so hard I agreed. Dawn said quietly, Stealing Mr. Halliday's salary? Bennett hissed. His lawyer stood up, disputing the phrase. The sheriff allowed it, since that was what they were doing in this context. Bennett said, Harvey and Bryant, I went for it. We knew from Judith that he never checked the accounts, so he'll never know. Why did you fire him for no reason? Bennett was furious. No reason. That bastard let everyone know what we did. He made fools of us. He stood there with an evil smirk on his face and watched Bryant almost throw up. He crapped his pants. The look in his eyes said he hated us. I didn't realize he was so angry. If I had known, I never would have gotten involved. If I had left him there, one of us, or perhaps all of us, would have been looking over his shoulder, waiting to see what he would do. He put laxative chocolates in the kitchen. People had to stand in line to use the restroom. A lot of people had accidents. No one saw him, but we know it was him. Dawn said quietly, As with everything, you accuse Mr. Holiday with absolutely no evidence. You bullied him, stole from him, because you're jealous of the kind of man he is. You're pathetic. Dawn sat up. The sheriff tried not to laugh as Bennett explained the predicament the officers were in. He would talk to Dawn about it later. In his opinion, it was completely justified, and if I had been brought to trial and found guilty, he would have admonished me. Bryant spoke next. He told his lawyer that it was just a little fun to get back at me. Judith and he got close, thinking up ways to humiliate me. This went on much longer than expected. Over the vacations, I was just floored. Dawn asked just one question. Did you ever pay for the room you used or the beer you drank at his house? Bryant lowered his eyes. No. Things got even worse for Harvey. Dawn accused him of falsifying pay and annual leave records. She made sure his deception was on the court record. If the Bennetts went bust, which seemed likely, no employer would look favorably on him. The sheriff postponed sentencing for 2 weeks. Before the deadline came, he asked Dawn if I had been paid as Bennett had suggested. It was a negative answer. In summarizing his findings, he left them all unsupported. He admitted all the complaints in our favor. He awarded me £200,000 for their actions, £33,000 for non-payment of wages. He made a further order that none of them were to receive a penny of wages until all payments to me had been made. If an attempt is made to go bankrupt to avoid this, he has records showing that the firm's bank balance was in excess of £2 million. He will put them in prison for a long time. He made Bennett responsible for my legal fees. I was paid in full the next day. Bennett paid Dawn's legal fees, the full amount, nobody rates. I enjoyed the freedom. I felt better than I had in the last few years. I did some counseling and repair work that convinced me that instead of working for someone else who was screwing me over, I should work for myself. The biggest expense was specialized diagnostic equipment, costing upwards of £20,000 to £30,000. Bennett decided to liquidate the company before he lost everything as he had few customers left. On the day of the sale, Danny went there to try and buy the equipment on my behalf. I knew they wouldn't let me in. I set a budget of $30,000. The catalog had the first 4 items I really wanted, but I expected each of them to cost $10,000 and up. I was very surprised when Danny called and said I had all four for 17. I told him to try to get as many of the items I had marked down as possible. Later, he called back. He had spent 30, but there were 2 items left on my list that I had put a limit of 3 grand on. If I wanted them, he would loan me the money for them. I told him I didn't need the loan, but I wanted to get them if possible. With them, I started a company called Halliday Mechanical Services. I leased the van because the cost was about the same as when I bought it, but I didn't expect to get a good price in the future. I contacted my previous customers and was soon very busy. I received calls from several of Bennett's former co-workers who were hoping I would hire them. Not a chance in hell. One afternoon, I found myself driving home not far from the hotel Judith and Bryant were using. I bought Danny a few beers, but did nothing for Kate. I called and was delighted to find her working at reception. She smiled at me. "What can I do for you, sir?" She was great. She was a beautiful girl, but now she was fully a woman. Danny wasn't lying when he said she had the kind of body one could only dream of. I liked her smile right away. "Kate, I'd like to take you out to dinner to thank you for what you've done for me with Danny. If there's anything else you'd like to do, I'd be happy to do it. I owe you a lot." She smiled again. "You can take me to dinner tomorrow at 7. I finish at 6, but I'll shower here and try to look presentable for you." It was my turn to smile. "You are much more than presentable. You are beautiful even in your corporate clothes. I'll be here on time. Thank you for not brushing me off." We exchanged smiles and I left feeling like I had won the lottery. I was glad my job the next day was close to home and went smoothly. I finished early and came home. Showered and shaved, then started thinking about what to wear. I wanted to make an impression, but I wasn't sure what exactly. I felt worse than a 15-year-old on a first date. I realized that my closet needed an update. I was in place at 6:45. I was very nervous. She showed up a few minutes later. She was stunning. She was laughing at me. I realized my jaw had dropped. "I'm sorry, but you look absolutely gorgeous." I admitted, "I haven't had my tongue slurred like that since I was 15. She laughed and held out her hand to me. She took me to a restaurant. I don't remember what I ate, but I can tell you it was the best night of my life. After eating, we went to the lounge for a drink. I was glad I took a cab. Even if I hadn't been drinking, I don't think I would have been able to drive. She is very intelligent, and we talked about many topics. She never criticized my views, but made me explain when they differed from hers. We gently discussed our differences and learned so much more because of it. Her laughter lit up the room. It was after 10 o'clock when she said she had to go, as she had duty at 7 in the morning. I told her I would take a cab, but would take her home before I dropped her off if she wished. We did just that. She stopped about a half-mile from my house. Before we left the hotel, I said, "Kate, I came tonight because I am indebted to you for what you have done. I have never enjoyed an evening like this before. I'd like to ask you to meet me again if you don't think I'm too frank." She kissed me in response. She pulled out my cell phone and asked me to open it. She entered her number in there. I gave her mine and my email since she said she would send me her lists so I would know when she was available. We dated for 3 months. She's so sweet. I'm just trying to convince myself that she's another Judith. I know she isn't, but when she's working, I have another life. I've been spying on Bryant. Gradually, it's getting easier for him to go outside. He stopped when Harvey got a good beating. I was suspected, but I had an alibi since I worked at a factory 100 miles away and had a few other people with me. Bennett was a lot easier. He likes to have a good drink at the golf club, so he was caught 3 Fridays in a row over the legal limit. He was banned from driving for 10 years, must pass a sobriety test, and retake his driving test before he can be issued a license again. In total, he was fined £5,000. His wife is said to have kicked him out of the house and is divorcing him over adultery, demanding every penny she can get. But Bryant is personal. Eventually, I caught him walking through the park towards the pub. I beat the shit out of him again. The next afternoon, I was at home with Kate when the police called about the attack on Bryant. I had to tell them I didn't have an alibi. I didn't want to drag a friend into something that could lead to jail time. Everything I was wearing, clothes, mask, underwear, gloves, etc., was burned and completely destroyed before I got home. I didn't say a word to him. Kate laughed as she told the officers. I wouldn't have had the strength since we'd spent all day in bed. The policeman drove off. I looked at Kate. She was smiling. I took her hand and pulled her to me. And so we got down to it. Next chapter. At work, everything that could go wrong went wrong. Every time I fixed one part, another part failed. It was an older model, and I had already told them it needed to be replaced about 2 years ago. A new machine had been ordered, but it was due in 6 months, so I had to repair it. 2 days turned into 4. Kate and I talked on the phone. I loved hearing her voice and listening to her talk about her day. She laughed when I told her about things that were going wrong. The time alone made me look forward to the future. After Judith, I never looked for another partner, as I didn't feel I could trust again. Kate said she waited until I was ready. I thought about my life without her, and it would be disgusting. If anything, it would be worse than what I had with Judith. If anyone existed for me, it would be Kate. I knew I loved her more than I'd ever loved anyone before. I needed to talk to her about it, and what I needed. That day when I got home, she worked until 11 p.m. so I didn't see her. I was busy putting together an invoice for the job when the doorbell rang. I was surprised to see her there. She looked worried. I invited her to come in. I wanted to kiss her, but she pulled me away. Now I was concerned. She spoke softly, almost sadly. Adam, while you were away, Judith was at the hotel with her firm making a presentation. Afterward, she spoke to me. She knows we've been seeing each other. She asked me to ask you to talk to her. You have not spoken once since the documents were served. She will meet you wherever you wish. She said she has no intention of hurting us. She wants to explain everything to your face. I'm worried that you still have feelings for her. You never mention her. She's more experienced than me, so your life would be better than what we did. I don't want to lose you, but it's better to lose you now than later. She was almost sobbing when she finished. Kate, while I was gone, I thought about you a lot. I love you in ways I never thought possible. I've never loved anyone the way I love you. I kept you at a distance because I was very much afraid of being betrayed again, though every conscious thought in my brain said it would never do so. I never mentioned Judith because I feel nothing but contempt for her and for myself for letting her treat me the way she did. Judith is right. It's probably time to talk. She knows I will never forgive or forget what she did. She doesn't have any feelings for me, and I don't have any for her. You said you waited until I was ready. You were willing to wait because to you I was worth it, especially if I was with you at the end. I kept telling myself over and over to let love in, but I was so scared. You took that away. I want you in my life. Kate threw herself into my arms and kissed me. She said, I have a check in case it rains. Don't forget. A week later, I was talking to Judith at the small bar that nestled between us. She looked like she had lost a little weight and confidence. We ordered coffee. She started, Adam, thank you for agreeing to meet me. I can see that Kate is going good for you. You've never looked so happy in the last few years, if not your whole life. She's not like me, so take a chance. She's a beautiful woman. I want to apologize, even though I know that word sounds ridiculous coming from me, the nasty bitch. I've been thinking for a long time about why I ruined our marriage. At first I wanted to blame you, but Janine wouldn't let me. She made me realize how much I hurt you. I found a counselor who helped me learn the truth about myself and why I did it. I still have a lot of work to do. I could go on for weeks telling you about this, but I'll be brief. I've always been an egotist, a narcissist. I like to think I was better than others. When I met you, I saw a caring, loving man who was completely unaware of the impact he had on others. Because of your character, you could get any woman you wanted. You are so conscientious about everything you do. I loved this man, a feeling I had never felt before. You loved me, and because of that love, you would give me anything I wanted if you could. A diamond on our honeymoon, even if it meant we couldn't afford the tour you really wanted. Over time, I began to see your efforts to please me not as love, but as a sign of weakness. When we talked about children, I wanted one at first, but having lost track of who you were and, as a result, my respect for you, I decided against it. Once again, you didn't fight back. You always put me first, and I never realized what that really meant until it was too late. When Bryant and I met at an event, it was a fascinating conversation with your mortal enemy. I told him too much, and we met several times, talking mostly about you. He latched onto my disrespect for you. A few weeks later, he seduced me, even though I didn't resist. But you would have been a 100 point, and he would have been a 1. I kept coming back just for the thrill of doing it behind your back. My conscience was disgusting, but I took my self-loathing out on you. I made your life a living hell. In fact, hell would have been a better option. The need to humiliate you only grew. I still can't understand why it occurred to me. How could you humiliate yourself if you didn't know? Why did I treat you that way? I was just shocked when Bryant talked about coming to that holiday in your place. I knew that holiday was supposed to try to fix us, but once again, excitement and stupidity took over. Harvey and Bennett were in on it. I hadn't realized until that moment that Bryant was telling them everything. I was tormented by my conscience and became an ice maiden, rejecting your attempts at lovemaking because I didn't want to experience love. I was so disgusted with myself. I knew you didn't deserve the way I treated you. I didn't know until the trial that they orchestrated this, put up the pictures to publicly humiliate you. I'm very sorry. Those 2 days with Bryant should have been the last of my life. If I had known what you already knew, I never would have gone through with it. Listening to Dawn about the divorce and the case against Bennett made me feel so guilty. Because of my stupidity, a lot of shit came down on you and you didn't deserve any of it. I was so ashamed of the way I acted. I realized that the only person who was truly humiliated was me, and I deserved it. I couldn't believe I'd wasted my money on that bastard. When we came out of the church and saw our pictures and the priest's pictures, I realized you were behind it. I was mad as hell, but my conscience kept me going. You deserved it. That's when I sought counseling. After that incident, I caught Bryant and got my own revenge on him. It was at the club. She smiled, adding, I heard he wasn't working anymore, but he never got caught. Dad and my brother caught him and made him give me all the money back. I noticed it, but I didn't know the reason why. I'm sorry I was such a self-centered bitch who mistook love for submission, caring for weakness. I'm moving to another branch to get out of this town. All I get here if I go outside is a room. I need a fresh start, a chance to be a good person again. I may never find someone as good as you, but I have only myself to blame for losing you. I misinterpreted everything you did because of love as weakness, or as its strength. You didn't do anything wrong. If I can give you some advice, some of it I learned in therapy. It's okay to disagree, to want different things, but to discuss them. Don't just back down, because it will make the other person happy. Say what's on your mind. Bennett was only right about one thing. You're a hell of a great engineer. I'm not surprised you're doing well. You're a damn good person, just don't believe in yourself enough. Tell Kate about the feelings you're holding in because of me. Be a team player. She'll be good for you. With great sadness, she finished, I'm a damn fool. She stood up and said goodbye to me. I returned home where a worried Kate was waiting for me. I said those 5 little words. Kate, we need to talk. I smiled as she raised her eyebrows. I kissed her gently. I told her everything that had happened, about how Judith had mistreated me, and also about Bryant. I told her how I felt inferior, how I couldn't believe I deserved to live with her. When I was done, she was crying. I cried too. I unloaded on myself for the first time in my life. We finished crying, snuggled up against each other. When we finished crying, she wiped my face. Adam, Judith was right about two things. What a wonderful person you are and how little you realize it. Maybe if counseling helped her, it will help you too. When you mentioned the kids, I could tell from your voice how deeply it affected you. It's a lovely house, a large lot, and it could be expanded so you could have a lovely family home. All I can say is that if we were to live together, I would love to have children with you. I'm not Judith. I don't see you as a calm, thinking, weak person. I see a strong person who is always striving to be a better person, to help others. We'll disagree, we'll fight sometimes, but you'll always have my love and respect. Think back to our first night. Throughout dinner we talked, we had disagreements, but we discussed them and learned how different perspectives add to our experiences. We both need to talk, to discuss any problems that may arise. Later, she moved in with us, and we talked about renting her apartment. She wanted to wait a few months to make sure I was happy. A few weeks after she moved in, I was at the safe when she noticed the jewelry boxes. She insisted I get them. I opened the big one with diamonds and told her the story, including the fact that I didn't get to go on a tour I really wanted to go on. I'd purposely kept it from Judith because she'd betrayed me with Bryant. I blushed, taking the small box in my hands. Kate, this is a family heirloom. I gave it to Judith as a gift, but I kept it for myself. It's an engagement ring. I've been thinking about proposing to you for weeks now. I asked your father's permission, and he's thrilled, and so is your mom. Kate, will you marry me? We'll find you a new ring if you say yes. She looked into my eyes, smiling, her tears flowing. She said quietly, yes. She then opened a small box. This ring is beautiful. I will wear it proudly. It will need to be resized. I won't wear the diamond set because of its history. You wouldn't want me to wear it the same way, so I think you should give it to Judith as a parting gift. I contacted Judith and arranged to give her the diamond set. She was very grateful. She said that if she was ever tempted to do something bad, it would remind her of selfless love. I went to several counseling sessions and Kate went with me. They helped me a lot, although not as much as her love. It turned out that Kate really was my kind of love. I was so happy that a lot of people remarked on it. My business was growing by the day. I took on 3 more engineers whom I vetted thoroughly. They were not only excellent engineers, but also reliable, faithful, and in a strong marriage. They wouldn't mess around or put up with a coworker who had cheated on another. So Kate did most of the office work for me when her shifts allowed, but as my business grew, it became more and more. We discussed options. She worked for me full-time, hired office staff. She loved her job at the hotel. It was multidisciplinary. She was often out in front, but she also worked behind the scenes a lot. She had the skills for my office, but if we had kids, we would be looking for someone else. So I took over the office, hiring an assistant who could do most of the administrative work. Kate handled a lot of the accounts, which she said didn't take much time because I was so organized. Kate and I got married in a small wedding. Danny was my best man. Her sister Jacqueline was my maid of honor. Her parents were very happy to see us both so happy. They always treated me like the son they never had. I couldn't have wished for better relatives. Kate made me go on my honeymoon. She organized it especially for me. It included an excursion that I wanted to visit on my first honeymoon. We both enjoyed the tour of ancient sites, although I was more into history than she was. I had to suffer for it as she loves roller coasters, so I got to ride with her many times the next week as we visited several theme parks. As I was driving back to the hotel, she casually revealed that she was a commando. At least I think it was accidental. We had to hurriedly get ready for most meals as we explored each other as soon as we entered the hotel room. A couple months later, her parents were even happier as their first grandchild was born. Kate and I moved into her apartment while the builders renovated and expanded our home. The work was finished a month before our first child, Gordon, was born. He was followed by a sister, Jennifer, and then another boy, John. 11 years later, I have 12 engineers and half a dozen office staff. Cheryl still watches out for the day of the bad secretary. If we're overworked, she leaves my office. Since the firm is small, I know her husband and I won't do anything that could damage their relationship with the employees. I still vet new employees thoroughly. I will not hire anyone who plays games with me. As for Judith, I have seen her a couple times when she came to visit her parents. She's doing well professionally, but she's still single. One day, Kate spotted her at a local restaurant with Janine. She had a very sad and envious look on her face. Kate, our kids, and I were there to eat, and the kids were having fun in the little play park. I pushed their swings and caught Jennifer on the parachute. As we left, we said hello. Judith's adultery turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me as it led me to Kate. Her love and support means everything to me. I've never been happier. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.